They wore crowns forged in gold, dined on silver, ruled over millions, and yet they died in rented rooms, fled across borders, or pawned their jewels just to eat. These are not fairy tales. These are the bankrupt afterlives of monarchs who lost everything except their titles. From palaces to pensions, silk robes to secondhand coats, this is the story of kings and queens who learned too late that power fades faster than debt. Welcome to 27 kings and queens who died in Bavaria, 2-hour descent into the velvet-lined ruin of history's most regal beggars. Before we dive headfirst into royal ruin, do you send yourself a favor? Hit that subscribe button. It keeps this strange little kingdom of ours alive. And while you're at it, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Midnight in Madrid? Sunrise in Manila? We want to know who's joining us for this 2-hour fall from grace. King Charles I of England. Charles Stuart was a king who wore dignity like a tailored coat-tone he couldn't quite afford. In his world, image was more important than solvency, pride more valuable than prudence. But the irony of Charles's reign was simple. He believed himself above the common squabbles of finance, yet it was precisely these mundane squabbles that ultimately unraveled him. He ascended the throne in 1625, inheriting more than just a crown. His father, James I, had left him an estate burdened by lavish extravagance and perpetual insolvency. Charles, however, wasn't the sort of man who concerned himself with trivial things like budgets. Money, in his view, was something others worried about. Instead, Charles concerned himself with grandiose visions and the assertion of divine royal prerogative. Believing firmly in the principle of the divine right of kings, the king was answerable only to God, certainly not to something as pedestrian as Parliament. This philosophical stance had profound practical implications. When Charles found himself running low on funds, which was frequently, he simply dismissed Parliament and governed alone, raising taxes and levying fines without approval, creating what he called forced loans. Imagine for a moment a monarch who turns to his subjects and says with complete solemnity, "I require your loyalty expressed, preferably in gold, immediately and generously. Thank you." Predictably, his subjects saw this as somewhat less than divine. Despite the mounting discontent, Charles was utterly convinced of his correctness. He commissioned art, sponsored lavish court entertainments, and supported ambitious foreign wars, all on borrowed coin. There was a dangerous elegance to this financial juggling act. It was spectacularly unsustainable, yet oddly mesmerizing, like watching a man juggle flaming swords, fascinated less by his skill and more by the inevitability of catastrophe. When war erupted between Charles and Parliament, the English Civil War, it became clear how hollow his royal treasury truly was. He desperately scraped together armies, paying troops sporadically and inadequately. Loyalists often funded their own equipment, driven more by devotion than financial reward. Charles's desperate hope was that victory on the battlefield would solve his fiscal woes and reaffirm his unquestionable right to rule. But hope is not currency, and devotion doesn't feed armies indefinitely. The war dragged on, bleeding the nation's coffers dry. Parliament's forces, better organized and better funded, steadily gained ground. As Charles retreated from battlefield to battlefield, reality pursued him relentlessly, whispering insistently that divine right might hold less value than gold coins in the end. His debts piled higher, and support dwindled like grains of sand slipping through royal fingers. Eventually, defeat arrived dressed in parliamentarian colors, and Charles found himself captured. Even then, imprisoned and awaiting trial, he maintained his dignity with a stubborn, melancholic grace. But dignity was a poor shield against a jury, determined to judge him harshly for the crime of thinking himself beyond the concerns of mortal accountability, financial or otherwise. On a cold January morning in 1649, Charles stepped onto the scaffold, still wearing his carefully maintained dignity, even as he faced the executioner's axe. His final speech was characteristically poised, a last defiant insistence that he had acted for the good of his subjects, even if they hadn't yet realized it. The axe fell swiftly, severing more than just the king's head. It severed the illusion that royal power alone could defy the practical realities of money and obligation. But here's the bitterly ironic twist that history never tires of serving up. Charles's execution solved precisely nothing. The Commonwealth period that followed merely substituted royal extravagance for the grim austerity of Oliver Cromwell's Puritan Republic. Debts remained unpaid, discontent simmered, and before long, the monarchy was restored, as though history itself couldn't bear such dry sobriety. Charles's demise didn't end monarchy, it merely underscored a fundamental truth. Royalty without money was merely theater without prop, shallow, unsatisfying, and ultimately doomed. A truth, tragically poetic, that generations of future royals would repeatedly rediscover, each thinking themselves uniquely immune. Yet Charles's fate was only the first domino in a long chain, as other crowned heads were destined to tumble into financial oblivion. None learned the lesson Charles so brutally illustrated, that wealth and privilege might buy illusion, but illusion is always fleeting, and the bill inevitably comes due. King Louis XVI of France. If there ever was a king whose life seemed designed by fate as an ironic parable on the perils of financial ignorance, it was Louis XVI of France. Picture a man with the earnest countenance of a diligent locksmith-harnessed, well-intentioned, but hopelessly out of his depth when handed the keys to an entire kingdom. Louis was the rare monarch whose fatal flaw wasn't cruelty or tyranny, but profound, unyielding naivety. He would have been better suited to a quiet life of clockmaking, perhaps, meticulously tinkering away at delicate machinery in peaceful obscurity. Instead, history thrust him onto the grand stage of Versailles, amid glittering chandeliers and powdered wigs, oblivious to the ticking time bomb beneath his polished heels. Louis XVI inherited a kingdom already bleeding from years of war, extravagance, and systemic financial mismanagement. His grandfather, Louis XV, famously shrugged off warnings with cynical indifference, uttering the words, "Après moi, le déluge, after me, the flood." And indeed, the flood was already seeping beneath the ornate palace doors by the time Louis XVI ascended to the throne. Yet, rather than confronting the growing fiscal catastrophe, Louis responded with characteristic hesitation and indecision, stumbling toward disaster one benign misstep at a time. To make matters worser, perhaps perfectly suited to dramatic irony, Louis found himself supporting the American Revolution. On the surface, it was an inspired move. Undermining Britain, France's age, old rival, seemed deliciously shrewd. But Louis failed to notice that cheering revolution abroad while ignoring discontent at home was akin to enthusiastically supporting the neighbor's kitchen fire while neglecting the flames devouring your own dining room curtains. In pouring vast sums into the American cause, Louis's France secured a moral victory but plunged itself into deeper financial ruin, turning political triumph into economic disaster. Back at Versailles, Louis was blissfully distracted, ensconced in the decadent monotony of courtly life. His advisors warned of empty coffers, Yet he responded by commissioning extravagant spectacles, glittering court balls, and lavish feasts that epitomized the tone-deaf extravagance of royalty. Versailles sparkled brilliantly beneath a sun of borrowed gold, oblivious to the storm clouds gathering beyond its gardens. As public hunger grew more acute, Versailles' kitchens continued to produce dishes elaborate enough to make Marie Antoinette's famous, albeit apocryphal, quip, "Let them eat cake," sound almost restrained. The irony of Louis's reign was inescapable. He genuinely wished to be a good king. He was a reformer, at least in spirit, longing to modernize France's medieval finances. He called meetings, summoned assemblies, and even invited Jacques Necker, a popular and charismatic Swiss banker, to untangle the kingdom's snarled finances. But Louis's courage faltered whenever true reform threatened to anger nobles or clergy. Time and again, he stepped back, wringing his hands and sighing helplessly tragically, convinced that someone else, somewhere else, would fix the kingdom's crumbling finances. But the gods of irony have little patience for indecisive kings. France was spiraling toward bankruptcy, and its king was becoming the symbol of incompetence rather than grandeur. As bread prices soared and the poor starved, pamphlets circulated vicious caricatures of Louis and his Austrian queen. Marie Antoinette, portrayed as gluttonous parasites feeding off the misery of their subjects. Financial distress had transformed from dry accounting ledgers into visceral anger in the streets, and Louis's indecision had turned to outright paralysis. In 1789, that fury exploded spectacularly into the French Revolution. Louis was swept helplessly along as crowds stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison symbolizing tyranny. Still, he hesitated, caught between his desire to preserve tradition and the revolutionary tidal wave threatening to sweep him aside. Soon enough, the royal family found itself reduced from divine rulers to political hostages. Versailles was abandoned, replaced by confinement at the Tuileries Palace, where Louis shuffled through halls, now patrolled by revolutionary guards, a monarch without money or authority, merely a shadow king amid the ruins of former glory. His fate was sealed in 1793, a cold January day echoing that of another monarch, Charles I of England. Louis XVI, stripped of titles, reduced simply to Citizen Louis Capet, climbed the steps of the guillotine, silent and dignified. His reign, marked by indecision and financial mismanagement, ended definitively with the thud of a falling blade. But France's financial troubles didn't vanish with him. They persisted, a testament to the harsh truth Louis's life underscored. Money ignored does not disappear. Debts unpaid do not vanish. Instead, they linger, demanding payment in blood and chaos. Yet Louis's demise wasn't merely personal tragedy, was a cautionary tale about royal blindness, the arrogance of extravagance, and the bitter cost of ignoring economic realities. But as his headless body was carried away, France's rage still simmered, unsatisfied by mere royal blood. Their anger soon turned toward another symbol of extravagance, a woman whose name had become synonymous with reckless spending and disdainful privilege, a queen known to history as Marie Antoinette Madame d'Officie herself. If you're still with us after 2 decapitations and 1 national meltdown, you're our kind of people. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it? Are you unraveling royal ruin over morning coffee, or falling asleep to the sound of collapsing empires? Queen Marie Antoinette of France. Marie Antoinette, born into Austrian royalty and transplanted to Versailles at 15, was always destined for tragedy. But tragically, she was also the very last to realize it. To the public, she became Madame de Fissy, a title as cutting as it was deserved, highlighting her perceived reckless indulgences amid a starving nation. But the reality was always more complicated. Marie Antoinette was neither purely villain nor purely victim, but rather a potent mixture of naive idealism, costly ignorance, and a stubborn refusaler, perhaps inability to see past the shimmering gates of Versailles. From the moment she stepped onto French soil, Marie Antoinette lived inside a lavish bubble, isolated from reality, surrounded by silk-clad courtiers whose smiles often concealed daggers. Versailles was her playground, and she eagerly embraced its frivolities. With little else demanded of her beyond appearances and air production, she immersed herself in elaborate gowns, extravagant hairstyles towering impossibly high, and glittering jewels, unaware or perhaps uncaring of how her habits drained France's already depleted treasury. Yet it wasn't her penchant for diamonds alone that sealed her fate. No, it was something more insidious, her carefully cultivated ignorance. Marie Antoinette's world was designed for diversion, not reflection. She spent her days gambling vast sums, redecorating apartments with furnishings costing enough to feed whole villages, and entertaining friends at her private retreat, the Petit Trianon, an idyllic, make-believe farm that mocked rural poverty with picturesque barns and porcelain milk churns. It was her greatest irony. While peasants starved, their queen played shepherdess, costumed in a gauzy fantasy, utterly disconnected from the dirt and hunger of the real countryside. Public opinion soon transformed this careless queen into an exaggerated symbol of excess and callousness, casting her as a villain indifferent to the people's suffering. Popular press and whispered gossip spun tales, some true, many invented, all devastating. Her rumored response to starving peasants, "Let them eat cake," though never proven, became historical shorthand for aristocratic blindness and enduring myth, precisely because it captured so neatly the core of her tragedy. Yet beneath this caricature was a deeply human tragedy. Marie Antoinette was no puppet master gleefully orchestrating her nation's ruin. She was merely painfully, fatally blind. Isolated from reality by courtiers who filtered truth into something manageable and pleasant, she stumbled blindly toward disaster, never comprehending that the shadows cast by her silks and diamonds were actually the creeping darkness of a coming revolution. When revolution finally exploded, Marie Antoinette found herself unprepared for the brutal awakening. Versailles, her beloved palace of dreams, was stormed by mobs demanding bread and justice. Stripped of her jewels, gowns, and illusions, she fled with Louis XVI to Paris as prisoners, a queen suddenly confronted by a hostile world she neither recognized nor understood. As the kingdom crumbled around her, she clung desperately to the fragments of her royal dignity, unaware that dignity alone would not appease an enraged and impoverished populace. Marie Antoinette, who once held sway over France's treasury, now found herself forced to plead for basic necessities. In prison, she lived in squalor, without even a shred of privacy, dignity replaced by humiliation. She, who once gave orders from silk-covered chairs, was now subjected to insults from jailers who scorned her as the ultimate symbol of wasteful extravagance. Her existence had gone from lavish to pathetic, a painful illustration of how swiftly fortune can pivot, how abruptly privilege can become penury. Even during her trial, the irony persisted bitterly. She was accused not only of bankrupting France, but of unspeakable immorality, charges designed less for truth than spectacle. She who had spent her life performing before a glittering court was now forced into one final, humiliating performance before judges who had already decided her fate. Yet, even in her final hours, Marie Antoinette maintained a quiet dignity, a stubborn refusal to break entirely beneath their cruelty. But dignity, as previous monarchs discovered, cannot save lives, nor can it absolve debts. On the 16th of October, 1793, Marie Antoinette, dressed plainly in white, climbed into a cart bound for the guillotine. Crowds lining the streets hurled abuse, mocking the woman who once personified France's extravagance, now reduced to a mere object of their bitter hatred. The blade fell swiftly, silencing forever the queen who had spent a lifetime ignoring the cries beyond Versailles' gates. Her death was met with cheers, proof of the distance between perception and reality. The French saw her as villainous, indifferent to their suffering. History recognized her as tragic, oblivious, and inexcusably naive. Yet, even her execution brought no real relief to France's financial woes or its simmering resentments. The people discovered quickly that symbolic justice does not pay debts, nor feed empty stomachs. The queen was dead, but poverty remained a living, breathing curse. Perhaps that was Marie Antoinette's final, bitter lesson. The powerful illusion that removing one scapegoat could magically erase a nation's suffering. But Marie Antoinette would hardly be history's last monarch to find herself undone by extravagance, naivety, and debts that refused to disappear. For across Europe, other royals persisted in building their castles of fantasy and folly, heedless of the cost, deaf to the approaching footsteps of poverty, ruin, and downfall none more notoriously, or perhaps more poetically, than a certain Bavarian king whose dreams were so grandiose they consumed not only his treasury but his sanity. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. If ever there were a monarch who embodied the perilous intersection of fantasy and finance, it was Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King, a man whose dreams were bigger than his kingdom's treasury, and whose castles stood as monuments not only to artistic brilliance, but also to magnificent, unyielding debt. Ludwig was no ordinary king. He was an artist trapped in the robes of royalty, a dreamer whose imagination knew no price tag, and, tragically, a man whose obsessions led him not only toward financial ruin but ultimately madness. Ascending the Bavarian throne in 1864 at the tender age of 18, Ludwig inherited not only a kingdom but a boundless imagination that quickly outgrew the modest confines of his responsibilities. He had little interest in matters of state or the mundane drudgery of governance. Instead, his passion lay in Wagnerian operas, romantic poetry, and the ambitious architectural fantasies that consumed his waking thoughts and haunted his restless sleep. It began innocently enough, as such obsessions often do. Ludwig was mesmerized by Richard Wagner, the composer whose epic music spoke directly to his soul. He swiftly became Wagner's most devoted patron, spending vast sums from the royal treasury to fund operas and theatrical extravaganzas. While Bavaria watched bemusedly at first, indulgently amused by the young king's eccentricities, they soon grew wary as the royal purse opened wider and wider, draining the kingdom's resources with alarming efficiency. Yet Wagner's operas were merely the overture to Ludwig's grander obsession castle building. Ludwig envisioned castles that would exist beyond the boundaries of time, fortresses not for war but beauty. He yearned to create physical manifestations of his vivid dreams, fairy tale palaces that would immortalize his romantic vision forever. And thus, the kingdom began hemorrhaging money into spectacular structures, each more ambitious, elaborate, and financially ruinous than the last. Neuschwanstein Castle, perhaps Ludwig's most famous creation, was a prime example of royal excess. Perched dramatically atop rugged cliffs and nestled among alpine forests, its spires pierced the sky like a defiant marble-white illusion. Within its walls, Ludwig intended to recreate scenes from Wagner's operas in meticulous detail. Murals depicted myths and legends. Rooms glittered with gold and lapis lazuli, ceilings painted with celestial visions. It was pure artistic genius and complete economic madness. Soon, the reality of construction costs burst Ludwig's romantic bubble. The castle devoured more money than Bavaria's coffers could yield. As debts soared and creditors grew restless, Ludwig refused to relent. Advisors pleaded with him to cut back on his projects, reduce his extravagant spending, and confront the kingdom's mounting debts. Ludwig, however, retreated deeper into fantasy, doubling down on his dreams rather than facing financial reality. Debt was an inconvenient distraction. Beauty, in his mind, was eternal, worth any price. As Ludwig's financial stability unraveled, whispers about his sanity began to echo in court corridors and taverns alike. Bavarians grew weary of funding their king's fantastical daydreams, resentful that their taxes flowed into castles they would never inhabit and operas they could scarcely afford to attend. His reputation deteriorated from romantic idealist to reckless madman monarch whose fantasies were literally bankrupting his kingdom. In 1886, financial and political pressures reached a fever pitch. Ministers, doctors, and royal family members conspired, declaring Ludwig mentally incompetent, a convenient diagnosis that provided an excuse to end his ruinous reign. Ludwig, betrayed and confused, was forcibly removed from Neuschwanstein, taken to Burg Castle on Lake Starnberg, his fairy tale abruptly shattered by harsh political pragmatism. Days later, Ludwig's life ended mysteriously in the lake's icy waters, under circumstances never convincingly explained. His death, fittingly tragic, ensured that his fantasies would never be fully realized, but ironically, ensured their immortality in legend. Ludwig left behind a legacy of mesmerizing beauty, castles that would draw millions of tourists long after his kingdom forgot its financial struggles. Yet the cost was more than mere money. It was Ludwig's sanity, his throne, and ultimately, his life. Today, visitors wander Neuschwanstein's echoing halls, captivated by its surreal grandeur, seldom reflecting on the bitter irony beneath the gleaming surface. These towers of fantasy were financed, not merely with gold, but with delusion, debt, and despair. Ludwig's castles, seemingly so romantic, remain potent reminders of how easily the pursuit of dreams can slip into ruin, how quickly royal extravagance can become royal tragedy. But Ludwig II was hardly alone in his struggle with the seductive allure of luxury, nor was he the last royal to learn that dreams can exact a ruthless price. Across Europe, other royals danced dangerously close to the edge, convinced that privilege shielded them from poverty's biting illusion that would unravel swiftly for a king whose abdication, born of passion rather than pragmatism, forced him into a life spent constantly calculating the insufficiency of his allowance, forever haunted by the uncomfortable truth that even love had its financial limits. King Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. Some men abdicate thrones for honor, others for ideals, but Edward VIII abandoned his crown for love, a grand romantic gesture, worthy of poetry perhaps, but hardly practical in the world of royal bank accounts. Edward's decision to relinquish the British crown for Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whose charm captivated him completely, may have seemed like the ultimate declaration of devotion, but it also became the first painful step into a life haunted by financial discomfort. After all, love might conquer hearts, but even a king-turned-duke soon discovered that love alone did not pay the bills. Edward's early life was a tale of privilege cloaked in luxury. Born heir apparent to the British Empire, his every whim was catered to by servants, attendants, and admirers, all eager to satisfy the future king's desires before they were even fully formed. From the glittering corridors of Buckingham Palace to luxurious trips abroad, Edward rarely considered money indeed. Why would he? He moved through life with the certainty that wealth was as natural as breathing, an endless resource provided by birthright. Yet privilege blinded him to the practicalities of real-world finance, setting the stage for a lifelong struggle once that golden cushion was abruptly removed. When Edward ascended the throne in 1936, the British monarchy stood at the zenith of global power, an institution symbolizing stability, wealth, and tradition. Yet within months, Edward threw it all away, unwilling to surrender the woman he loved. With his famous radio broadcast delivered in a solemn yet curiously proud voice, he declared he could not fulfill his duties without the help and support of the woman I love. It was romantic, dramatic, and utterly naive. In a flash, Edward ceased to be king, becoming instead the Duke of Windsor, an exiled royal dependent on the generosity of a family that found his choices more embarrassing than endearing. At first, exile might have seemed glamorous, an endless vacation with the woman he adored. But the reality was far less romantic. Edward quickly realized the cost of leaving royalty behind was steep. He expected his brother, the new King George VI, and the British government to provide an allowance reflecting his previous royal status, maintaining the dignity befitting a former monarch. Yet Britain was recovering from economic depression, and Parliament's generosity had sharp limits. Edward soon found his financial expectations met not with sympathy but with chilly practicality. He would receive a stipend, certainly, but it would never be enough. Thus began Edward's quiet torment, hidden beneath impeccable tailoring and charming smiles. Accustomed to spending lavishly, hosting elaborate dinners and stylish parties, he now chafed under what he perceived as financial restraint. He bitterly complained that he was forced to live like a commoner, constrained by mere thousands per year rather than the lavish sums he believed due his station. His letters to family and friends often fixated on his perceived financial hardship, subtly pleading for greater generosity. It was as if Edward believed royalty had entitled him permanently, oblivious to the harsh reality that even kings must face. Once abdicated, royal privilege shrinks alongside royal titles. Adding insult to injury, Edward's exile took him across the globe, from France to the Bahamas, each move driven less by choice than by necessity. As governor of the Bahamas during World War I, an appointment born of both convenience and quiet punishment, openly lamented the local conditions, dismissively viewing the islands as a dreary backwater far beneath his dignity. Yet even there, Edward struggled to live within his means, compelled to entertain lavishly and uphold the appearance of comfort while privately worrying over mounting bills and expenses. The irony was unmistakable. A former king reduced to quietly counting coins, pretending wealth while secretly nursing resentment over lost luxury. Throughout their marriage, Edward and Wallis maintained the facade of endless elegance, hosting high society parties and living in stylish Parisian homes. But beneath their polished surface lurked perpetual insecurity. Edward privately sold off valuable heirlooms and possessions, quietly auctioning pieces of his royal past just to maintain their glamorous illusion. His every social event became a careful calculation of expense and appearance, driven not by genuine abundance but by desperate pretension. His bank accounts draining steadily into debts he tried to conceal with charm and wit. Yet perhaps the cruelest irony was Edward's lingering resentment toward the monarchy he left behind. He watched from afar as his brother, and then niece ascended the throne, enjoying the royal privileges he'd abandoned. His bitterness grew with each passing year, fueled by the inescapable truth. He had sacrificed a kingdom, not just for love, but for the illusion that love would somehow sustain him in comfort forever. But love, Edward eventually discovered, provides neither credit nor collateral. Even the grandest romantic gestures have financial consequences, and abdication proved shockingly expensive. Edward VIII's life thus stands as a bitterly poetic reminder of the price one pays for following one's heart without first checking the ledger. Yet, while his struggles were painful, they were merely the prologue to a series of royal financial tragedies, a harsh lesson that kings and queens would repeatedly learn in exilia, lesson sharply felt by another monarch whose exile turned privilege into persistent worry, whose kingdom's collapse left him wandering foreign shores, forever conscious of the limits of royalty when stripped of crown, throne, and most bitterly, coin. King Alfonso XIII of Spain. When Alfonso XIII ascended the Spanish throne at birth in 1886, an event so auspicious he was immediately declared king before his first breath, his life appeared destined to be one of endless prosperity and comfort. After all, what greater privilege exists than a crown placed upon one's head before one's eyes even opened to the world? Yet, Alfonso would soon learn the harsh, timeless lesson of royalty. Privilege given can just as easily be taken away, especially when accompanied by financial ignorance, political turmoil, and reckless extravagance. As Alfonso grew up, he enjoyed every comfort imaginable, cocooned within the walls of Madrid's palaces. Tutors and servants shaped his childhood, insulating him from the poverty and unrest simmering beyond palace gates. Alfonso's Spain was a land of sharp contrasts, glorious traditions paired uncomfortably with deep social divisions and economic fragility. Yet he saw only a kingdom designed for his enjoyment, a playground where money existed not as a practical necessity but as an abstract, bottomless resource. From early adulthood, Alfonso displayed a flair for extravagance that would have made even the most indulgent monarchs blush. He loved automobiles, lavish parties, fine clothing, and luxurious travel, seemingly unaware, simply indifferento, Spain's growing economic struggles. While he hosted extravagant balls and grand banquets in Madrid's royal palace, factories shuttered, farmers faced ruin, and unemployment soared. His indulgences echoed beyond palace walls, fueling resentment among citizens who viewed him less as a king than a careless dilettante squandering national resources. Yet it wasn't merely extravagance that spelled Alfonso's financial undoing, it was also his persistent misjudgment of Spain's volatile political climate. He presided over a nation seething with tension, plagued by regional unrest, social inequality, and a deeply polarized political landscape. In an era increasingly hostile to monarchies, Alfonso stumbled through his reign, alienating factions at every turn. Republicans, anarchists, socialists, conservative siege groups saw him as either dangerously ineffective or recklessly indulgent, a symbol of what had gone terribly wrong with Spain itself. By the 1920s, Alfonso's reckless spending habits and political blunders had depleted not only his personal wealth, but also the kingdom's treasury. Advisors pleaded with him to show fiscal restraint, but restraint was not a word found in Alfonso's royal vocabulary. He dismissed concerns as tedious annoyances, believing himself untouchable, shielded by divine right and royal tradition. In his arrogance, he failed to notice the ground shifting beneath his feet. In 1931, the inevitable finally occurred. The people, fed up with royal excess and economic decline, swept the monarchy aside. Spain proclaimed itself a republic, and Alfonso XIII suddenly found himself a king without a crown, a monarch whose fortune evaporated almost overnight. Forced into exile, he fled Spain hastily, leaving behind palaces, property, and privileges, carrying with him only fading memories and dwindling funds. Alfonso's exile marked a dramatic shift from royal splendor to a harsh new reality. Initially settling in Paris and later Italy, he discovered quickly that royal entitlement held little sway outside Spain's borders. He depended on financial assistance from sympathetic supporters and family, navigating a delicate balance between pride and dependence. Accustomed to grand estates and lavish living, Alfonso now found himself carefully managing dwindling resources, forced to count coins and negotiate allowances. Each new home he inhabited Parisian apartments, modest hotels, borrowed villas seemed more modest than the last, a humiliating descent that wore on him bitterly. Even worse than diminished circumstances was the ongoing struggle to maintain appearances. Alfonso sought desperately to project the illusion of royalty intact, hosting dinners and attending events with forced smiles, his well-tailored suits masking deepening financial anxieties. He wrote private letters lamenting the indignity of his situation, the sting of relying on charity, and the constant frustration of living beneath expectations. To compound Alfonso's humiliation, Spain's new republican government seized and liquidated his former estates, further crippling his finances. Legal battles stretched painfully long, extracting every ounce of dignity from the former king. Alfonso, once a man of boundless wealth and effortless charm, now waited anxiously for pensions and family handouts, endlessly aware of his fall from grace, forever marked by exile and poverty's cruel shadow. Perhaps the bitterest irony of Alfonso's life was the cruel lesson he learned too late, that royalty is not inherent in the man but rather in the throne. Remove the crown, and the king becomes merely a man, subject to the mundane pains of poverty, dependent on kindness and luck rather than birthright and tradition. Alfonso, born with the ultimate privilege, ended his days in exile, haunted by memories of a grandeur he could never reclaim. Yet Alfonso XIII's tragic decline was not unique. History repeated itself across Europe as monarchs, intoxicated by their power and indifferent to money's practical truths, tumbled from grace into impoverished exile. Even as Alfonso wrestled privately with financial ruin, another Spanish monarch would soon find herself following his footsteps into exile, her life unraveling slowly as luxury turned to mere survival, privilege reduced to pension, and a crown replaced by bitter remembrance. Queen Isabella II of Spain. There is a certain tragic poetry in being crowned before one can properly walk or speak, a kind of cruel joke played by history on those unfortunate enough to be born royal. Queen Isabella II of Spain ascended the throne at the tender age of 3, child whose toys were golden scepters, whose nursery rhymes were royal proclamations. But the early coronation was no fairy tale. It set the stage for a life plagued by scandal, financial mismanagement, and ultimately exilian existence that twisted luxury into an ironic curse. Isabella's reign was marked from the outset by chaos. As a child queen, she was a mere pawn in the brutal chess game of Spanish politics. Courtiers, generals, and ambitious ministers all jostled to control the throne, each promising stability but delivering only debts, division, and corruption. Isabella grew up surrounded by advisors who viewed her kingdom not as a responsibility but as a limitless treasury to exploit. Thus, from childhood, Isabella was taught to spend lavishly and govern carelessly, convinced by courtiers that royal wealth was inexhaustible, as everlasting as the sun itself. By the time Isabella reached adulthood, extravagance had become a defining feature of her court. Spain's economy struggled, Agricultural sectors collapsed, and poverty spread like a creeping disease. Yet Isabella, locked within the decadent confines of Madrid's palaces, seemed utterly oblivious to the suffering beyond her walls. She threw extravagant balls, hosted opulent dinners, and adorned herself in gowns shimmering with gold thread and diamonds, seemingly convinced that such ostentatious displays somehow demonstrated her strength as queen. To the Spanish people, however, these displays were not strength, they were grotesque mockery, evidence of a monarchy hopelessly out of touch with reality. As Isabella lavished fortunes upon herself and her favorites, her government spiraled into chronic debt. Ministers scrambled to raise funds by imposing new taxes and seizing property, desperate attempts to patch the kingdom's gaping financial wounds. But money vanished into palace accounts as quickly as it appeared, drained by Isabella's never-ending appetite for luxury. Her reckless disregard for economic prudence was matched only by her blindness to growing public resentment. Even as the murmurs of discontent outside Madrid's gates grew louder, Isabella continued to dance, gamble, and spend. Convinced that the disquiet would eventually vanish, perhaps drowned out by the music of her lavish parties. Yet discontent did not vanish. Instead, it grew into outright rebellion. Isabella's personal life, already notorious for scandals, became political ammunition for those seeking her downfall. Her alleged affairs, her public arguments with her husband, and the open contempt she displayed for certain members of her court were eagerly broadcast in revolutionary pamphlets, fanning flames of outrage among an already suffering populace. Isabella, once viewed as merely extravagant, was increasingly cast as morally corrupt a monarch unworthy of her throne, whose very existence insulted struggling Spaniards. In 1868, the inevitable occurred. Revolution erupted, sweeping through Spain like wildfire. Isabella fled hastily to France, abandoning not only her palace but her jewels, gowns, and other symbols of royal extravagance, all seized by rebels eager to erase every trace of her reign. Suddenly, Isabella was queen no longer, merely an exile dependent on the charity of foreign governments and sympathetic relatives. Her grand palaces were replaced by rented apartments, luxurious banquets by modest dinners, lavish wardrobes by simpler gowns. Each step of her exile marked by humiliating concessions to economic reality. Life in exile proved harshly illuminating for Isabella. Accustomed to unlimited wealth and constant adoration, she now lived on a government pension that, while generous by common standards, was painfully inadequate compared to her former extravagance. She moved restlessly between Paris, Rome, and other European capitals, always conscious of dwindling resources, forced to monitor expenses closely, a queen reduced to counting francs and carefully balancing her accounts. Her letters grew bitter, lamenting her fall from royal splendor, filled with resentment toward those who had betrayed her and nostalgia for a crown she would never reclaim. Even more painful for Isabella was the reality of her reputation. Once admired or, at least feared, she became an object of mockery, dismissed as a scandalous, irresponsible figure whose reckless spending had driven Spain to ruin. She struggled to accept this new identity, stubbornly clinging to illusions of grandeur, dressing elegantly even when attending small gatherings, desperately projecting an air of dignity and wealth she no longer possessed. The proud queen found herself forced to sell jewelry and heirlooms secretly, quietly pawning fragments of her royal past just to sustain the present illusion of comfort. Yet despite her struggles, Isabella stubbornly refused to learn humility. Her extravagant instincts survived, exile intact, evident in her endless efforts to maintain appearances. She hosted modest gatherings that still sought to recapture something of the old grandeur, lavishly decorated rooms masking bitter truths beneath painted walls. Friends and supporters secretly whispered about the tragic irony of her plight once the queen who squandered a nation's wealth, now the exile desperately pretending wealth had never left her. Perhaps Isabella's greatest tragedy was the unshakable delusion that royalty itself could insulate her from poverty's cruel reality. She spent her exile living between two worlds, the remembered opulence of her youth and the harsh economic truths of her exile, unable or unwilling to fully embrace either. The irony was cruelly poetic. Isabella's story was never simply one of political defeat but of financial ruin, an exile defined not merely by lost power, but by dwindling fortunes and broken illusions. Yet Isabella's exile was not unique, merely another thread in history's grim tapestry of royal folly. As she struggled privately, another Iberian monarch was about to experience a similar fate. Exiled, humbled, and financially constrained, living quietly in foreign shadows, forever haunted by a past that refused to grant absolution, King Manuel II of Portugal. There's a peculiar sort of tragedy reserved for kings who find themselves thrust onto thrones they neither desired nor understood, monarchs caught between destiny and disaster, their reigns short and their downfalls abrupt. King Manuel II of Portugal embodied this fate with an elegance tinged in irony. Ascending to the throne abruptly, after the assassination of his father and older brother, Manuel found himself navigating a royal ship already sinking under the weight of political turmoil and fiscal disaster. His kingdom was teetering toward collapse, and Manuel, just 18 years old, scholarly, shy, and bookish, was tragically unequipped to steer it clear. From the outset, Manuel's Portugal was burdened by profound economic distress, political instability, and deep-seated resentment against the monarchy. The lavish expenditures and reckless spending of previous rulers had drained the royal treasury and stoked resentment among the populace. Manuel inherited not only a fragile throne but a bankrupt kingdom, a nation drowning in debts accumulated by predecessors whose extravagance overshadowed prudence. The irony was stark. A scholarly young king, who would have preferred a quiet life amid libraries and dusty archives, forced instead into the turbulent arena of political chaos and looming bankruptcy. Yet Manuel made an earnest effort, desperately trying to bring stability and modernity to a country that teetered precariously on the brink. Unlike many of his extravagant ancestors, he pursued modest reforms, attempted to balance the books, and showed genuine concern for the economic plight of his people. But history rarely rewards earnestness alone, and Manuel soon discovered that the accumulated financial recklessness of past monarchs had left him dangerously exposed, financially vulnerable, and politically weakened. Manuel struggled to hold together the fractured pieces of his kingdom, surrounded by advisors who whispered contradictory advice and factions whose loyalty was fickle at best. His youth and inexperience were seen by revolutionary elements as exploitable weaknesses. Meanwhile, royalists demanded lavish displays of power and wealth that Manuel neither possessed nor could responsibly display. Caught between the expectations of tradition and the harsh realities of an empty treasury, Manuel became trapped in a cruel paradox, expected to exhibit regal grandeur while secretly counting every coin in the royal coffers. Despite his attempts at modesty and restraint, the shadow of previous extravagance haunted Manuel's reign. Revolutionary propaganda painted him as yet another royal parasite, unfairly lumping his prudent intentions with the reckless indulgence of predecessors. The populace, weary of broken promises and economic stagnation, saw no difference between a sincere king striving for reform and the extravagant royals who preceded him. Financial ruin, it seemed, had stained the Portuguese monarchy permanently, and Manuel's earnest efforts could do little to erase the bitter legacy of debt and disillusionment. In 1910, barely 2 years after ascending the throne, the monarchy's end arrived abruptly. Republican revolutionaries stormed the streets of Lisbon, determined to abolish the monarchy entirely. Manuel, unprepared and stunned by the swift collapse, fled Portugal hurriedly, leaving behind palaces, possessions, and any lingering illusions of a stable throne. Overnight, the young king became a refugee, stripped not only of political power but also of financial security and social standing. Forced to flee to England with little more than memories and anxiety about an uncertain future. Life in exile in England proved a stark contrast to his brief reign. Manuel settled quietly in the rural countryside, occupying modest residences rather than lavish palaces, gradually accepting his new life as a private citizen. Although he received some support from sympathetic monarchist supporters and from the British royal family, Manuel's lifestyle was dramatically reduced from the splendor expected of a reigning monarch. Gone were the elaborate ceremonies, the grandeur of Lisbon's palaces, the pomp of royal pageantry. Instead, he lived quietly, dedicating his days to reading, scholarly pursuits, and writing about Portuguese history, a king forced into scholarly obscurity by political disaster. Financial constraints became a constant reality in exile. Manuel carefully managed his limited resources, forever aware of the precariousness of his situation. He occasionally sold personal belongings, royal artifacts, heirlooms, even cherished books from his private library to support himself, silently bearing the humiliation of pawning off his royal past to sustain his modest present. Despite his private frustrations, Manuel maintained a dignified facade, outwardly calm and composed, masking inner struggles with grace and stoic resolve. In quiet, reflective moments, Manuel might have wondered how his life had taken such a drastic turn from youthful king, presiding over a hopeful nation, to an exile, quietly rationing his resources. Perhaps he reflected bitterly on how the extravagance of his predecessors had doomed him, how his earnest attempts at reform were swept aside by revolutionaries who viewed monarchy itself as irredeemably tainted. Yet Manuel bore his hardships privately, determined not to descend into bitterness or resentment. Instead, he quietly adapted, learning humility, pragmatism, and financial discipline, virtues rarely required by royalty but deeply essential to his survival. The irony of Manuel's story was profound and poignant. A king who never desired extravagance or luxury was nonetheless forced to pay dearly for the reckless indulgences of his ancestors. His exile was not just a political punishment. It was a lifetime sentence to careful budgeting, quiet dignity, and constant restraint, a reversal of fortune that was cruelly undeserved. Manuel had become a king in name only, forever marked by poverty, always haunted by the bitter ghost of lost prosperity. Yet his story was not unique. Across Europe, royalty faced similar fates, discovering with grim clarity that power and wealth, once lost, were rarely regained. For Manuel, exile was not merely personal tragedy, was an ominous foreshadowing of the fate awaiting another monarch, whose throne would soon be toppled by revolution, whose crown would become little more than a distant memory, and whose life abroad would be defined not by royalty but by relentless financial struggle and lingering regret. King Constantine II of Greece. Few monarchs embody the stark contrast between lofty birthright and harsh reality, quite like King Constantine II of Greece. Born into royalty, educated in privilege, and raised to see his kingdom as a birthright rather than responsibility, Constantine's life appeared destined for ease and comfort. Yet, as history loves cruel irony, his story evolved into a powerful cautionary tale about the frailty of royal privilege and the mercilessness of political tidis, a lesson delivered through financial ruin and relentless exile. Constantine ascended the Greek throne in 1964, inheriting a crown that shimmered deceptively. His kingdom was unstable, shaken by political factions, deep economic divisions, and tensions simmering beneath a facade of sunny Mediterranean calm. Still, Constantine believed himself invincible, insulated by royal tradition and personal popularity. Charming and athletic, he projected the ideal image of a modern monarch, handsome, worldly, seemingly confident. He walked through Athens with the easy stride of someone who had never once worried about money or political survival, his days filled with elegant parties, sporting events, and luxurious trips abroad. Privilege had been his constant companion since birth, convincing him that the stability of his throne was as assured as the warmth of the Greek sun. Yet beneath the glittering surface, trouble brewed. Constantine inherited an unstable country riddled with political infighting and deep economic fissures that even royal charm could not mask indefinitely. His youthful confidence, once an asset, gradually morphed into reckless arrogance. His court remained lavish, even as Greece's economy stagnated and political factions became dangerously polarized. Constantine continued to spend extravagantly, maintaining a lifestyle that seemed indifferent, almost defiantly, to the financial and political struggles of his citizens. It was as though the king believed royal privilege would shield him indefinitely from economic realities, unaware that privilege itself has limits. Those limits became painfully apparent in 1967, when a military coup dramatically shattered Constantine's illusions. Overnight, generals seized power, and Constantine, confused, desperate, and ill-prepared, attempted a counter-coup that failed spectacularly. With breathtaking suddenness, he transformed from a privileged monarch to a fugitive forced into exile, fleeing Greece hastily aboard a small aircraft, leaving behind palaces, possessions, and prestige. He carried little more than confusion and regret, never fully comprehending how quickly fortune could shift from unlimited abundance to desperate exile. In exile, Constantine's world shrank rapidly. Accustomed to living with an almost effortless luxury, he soon discovered the harsh reality of financial hardship. Settling first in Rome and later in London, he struggled to maintain a lifestyle even remotely reflective of his former royal stature. His Greek properties had been seized by the new government, and his funds, previously limitless, dwindled alarmingly. Each new home became progressively more modest, each social gathering less extravagant. Privately, Constantine lamented the indignities of XIII, no longer a king commanding a nation but merely a displaced royal, quietly counting every pound and lira, forever aware of diminishing resources. Throughout his exile, Constantine grappled with prolonged legal battles against the Greek government, hoping desperately to reclaim lost assets. The litigation dragged painfully on, draining both resources and dignity. In courtrooms across Europe, the former king argued passionately for compensation, not simply to restore wealth, but also to reclaim lost pride. Yet each legal defeat deepened his financial insecurity, reinforcing the bitter reality that exile was not merely political punishment, but a long, humiliating lesson in the harsh economics of royal downfall. As Constantine adjusted reluctantly to his new existence, his life became defined by quiet restraint. Once accustomed to carefree spending and unquestioned privilege, he now carefully budgeted expenses, negotiating allowances from sympathetic relatives and supporters. The former king, who had once signed royal decrees without second thought, now signed checks cautiously, each signature underscoring the painful truth that wealth, once lost, is rarely recovered fully. Privately, he sold heirlooms, possessions, and family memorabilia, an agonizingly ironic exercise in monetizing royal heritage simply to sustain daily life. Yet, despite these painful lessons, Constantine never lost his pride entirely. He remained outwardly dignified, attending royal gatherings and weddings, projecting an air of grace that concealed private anxieties. He held on to the trappings of monarchy as best he could, determined to preserve a sense of identity amid financial constraint. Still, beneath polished surfaces lay persistent worry, a subtle desperation born of dwindling funds and lost authority. He had become a king without a kingdom, a monarch without a treasury, forever reminded by circumstances that royalty, stripped of economic power, becomes tragically ordinary. Constantine's life thus became a poignant symbol of monarchy's precarious Naturen existence, shaped not by divine right or tradition, but by money, politics, and fortune's cruel whims. He discovered, as countless exiled royals before him, that privilege is fragile, luxury fleeting, and wealth easily stripped away by political upheaval and economic realities. The irony was bitter, yet profound. A king raised in absolute privilege, forced by circumstances into perpetual restraint. His exile defined not simply by lost status, but by the constant threat of financial insecurity. Yet, Constantine's exile was merely another chapter in a long history of royal downfalls, each monarch discovering too late that privilege alone is insufficient protection against poverty's sharp bite. For even as Constantine adjusted uneasily to exile's austerity, another royal across the Mediterranean was facing a similar fate, a king whose lavish indulgences and unchecked extravagance had not only consumed his nation's wealth, but laid the groundwork for a downfall so spectacular that even exile itself seemed inadequate punishment for such reckless royal decadence. King Farouk of Egypt. King Farouk of Egypt was not a man who understood moderation. Indeed, he saw excess not merely as privilege, but as his sacred birthright, a royal mandate carved in marble, gilded in gold, and inscribed on every extravagant indulgence imaginable. Born into wealth and raised in opulence, Farouk ascended Egypt's throne at 16, inheriting a kingdom ripe with promise, but already burdened by the reckless extravagance of his predecessors. Yet Farouk, rather than exercising caution or prudence, immediately accelerated toward even greater indulgence, turning his court into a spectacle of staggering decadence, obliviouser, perhaps indifferento, the financial consequences spiraling quietly beneath his feet. Farouk's extravagance was legendary, even by royal standards. His palace glittered like an endless bazaar of luxury. His wardrobes overflowed with thousands of tailored suits, silk ties, and shoes, some reportedly worn only once before being discarded. His garage became famous not merely for its size, but for the breathtaking variety of rare and costly automobiles it housed. Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, Ferrari-seek, purchased impulsively, driven briefly, and abandoned casually in favor of the next shiny marvel. The sheer wastefulness was as astonishing as it was unsustainable, a constant drain on Egypt's treasury, an insult to the poverty-stricken millions struggling daily beyond the gates of his palaces. Yet cars and clothing were merely superficial expressions of Farouk's insatiable appetite for extravagance. He gambled prodigiously, losing vast sums at casinos in Europe's glittering capitals, laughing off debts that equaled entire fortunes. He dined extravagantly, flying delicacies from across the world to his table, feasting on caviar and rare seafood even as Egypt's economy sputtered and food shortages threatened stability. He hosted lavish parties aboard his yacht, each event meticulously planned, not for diplomacy or charity, but purely for spectacle. Farouk reveled in excess, seemingly convinced that such displays of wealth and indulgence somehow solidified his royal status rather than weakening it fatally. However, Farouk's reckless extravagance had deeper consequences than merely economic ruin. It also fostered profound resentment among Egyptians who saw their king's indulgences as an unbearable mockery. Public anger simmered quietly at first, manifested in whispered criticisms, resentful glances, and private mutterings among citizens barely able to feed their families. But resentment soon hardened into outright hostility. Farouk became not merely a figurehead of decadence, but a symbol of moral corruption, embodying everything Egyptians despised about monarchy: arrogance, ignorance, wastefulness, and indifference to human suffering. Even as political tensions intensified, Farouk remained defiantly oblivious. Advisors pleaded with him to curtail spending, exercise restraint, or at least pretend to empathize with the impoverished masses. Yet Farouk dismissed such advice with contemptuous amusement, viewing warnings about financial ruin as tedious distractions from his lavish pleasures. To Farouk, royalty was entitlement without obligation. Extravagance was expression without consequence. But history delights in delivering consequences, and Farouk soon faced them with merciless suddenness. In 1952, military officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser revolted, determined to dismantle the corrupt monarchy that Farouk's excess had come to symbolize. The revolution succeeded swiftly, capturing Egypt's imagination and forcing Farouk into sudden exile. Almost overnight, the king who had bathed in gold and feasted on extravagance became a powerless exile, hastily fleeing Egypt aboard his yacht, weighed down not only by personal humiliation, but by the looming uncertainty of life, stripped of unlimited wealth. Farouk's exile in Europe became a stark revelation in financial vulnerability. Although he carried away some wealth, his resources dwindled rapidly, consumed by debts accumulated through years of lavish spending. He struggled to adjust to diminished circumstances, maintaining appearances through careful pretense while privately panicking over shrinking bank balances. Gone were unlimited palaces, endless wardrobes, and carefree extravagance. Now Farouk faced a new reality of budgeting, caution, and constraint, a humiliating transformation from unlimited royal to cautious exile. In quiet desperation, Farouk sold personal possessions, priceless antiques, cherished automobiles, even jewels and heirlooms to sustain his lifestyle. Auctions quietly dispersed pieces of his former life, converting royal extravagance into mundane cash, a humiliating irony for a man who had once viewed wealth as inexhaustible. Privately, Farouk lamented the loss of grandeur, bitterly resentful of exile's cruelty, forever haunted by memories of privilege no longer attainable. The king, who had once spent without thought now, counted pennies carefully, painfully aware of the irony embedded in every coin he reluctantly surrendered. Yet even in exile, Farouk stubbornly clung to illusions of royal grandeur. He frequented luxurious hotels and fashionable restaurants, appearing publicly with forced bravado, maintaining an appearance of wealth even as financial reality eroded beneath his feet. Friends quietly whispered about Farouk's secret humiliations, noting subtle signs of financial desperation beneath carefully polished surfaces, a worn suit hastily repaired, jewelry conspicuously absent, hesitant glances at bills presented discreetly by anxious waiters. Farouk's exile was ultimately a study in painful contrasts: luxury, replaced by scarcity, indulgence giving way to careful calculation, pride surrendering gradually to shame. The man who had once personified lavish royalty became instead an exile forced into economic submission, forever reminded that privilege, once squandered, is rarely regained. Yet Farouk's fall was more than personal tragedy. It was also a powerful lesson in the dangers of unchecked extravagance, a bitter reminder that royal wealth is fragile, privilege temporary, and financial ruin always lurking at the edges of indulgence. But Farouk was hardly alone in his bitter exile. Across Europe, Other monarchs were discovering similar truths, rulers whose reigns had once glittered brightly, whose wealth had seemed inexhaustible, yet whose final days were spent quietly counting coins, selling memories, and navigating the harsh practicalities of exile. Among them was a once mighty emperor who would soon learn firsthand that imperial wealth, stripped away by revolution and war, leaves little behind but stark humiliation and financial ruin, a bitter irony even royalty itself could never escape. 10 royals down, and somehow the crowns keep getting heavier and the pockets emptier. If you're still watching, you're clearly invested in this royal slow burn. So subscribe if you haven't yet. It keeps the stories coming. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Late night binge in Bucharest? Lunch break in Lagos? We're listening. Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany. Few monarchs embody the tragic irony of power, pride, and precipitous fall quite as vividly as Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. A man who wore arrogance like a finely tailored uniform, Wilhelm ascended the throne, convinced of his own infallibility. From youth, he was raised to believe he was chosen by destiny itself, a divinely sanctioned emperor whose whims were not merely royal commands but near divine decrees. Yet, as history enjoys reminding those who grow too comfortable in their pride, power and wealth come not with permanence but with cruel, inevitable conditions. Wilhelm's empire was expansive, wealthy, and seemingly invincible, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the borders of France, from the industrial heartlands of the Ruhr to Prussia's expansive agricultural fields. At his peak, Wilhelm presided over an economic giant whose industry roared like a furnace, whose army marched with clockwork precision, and whose treasury seemed an endless wellspring of wealth. Money, like power, seemed inexhaustibly an imperial birthright that Wilhelm treated as casually as he wore his gleaming military regalia. Yet beneath this grand facade simmered tensions that Wilhelm either ignored or misunderstood entirely, convinced by pride that his empire could never falter. But falter it did, spectacularly. Wilhelm's reign unraveled rapidly amid the horrors and expense of World War I. The war, initially seen by Wilhelm as a glorious expression of imperial might, quickly became an economic nightmare, draining German coffers at a breathtaking pace. As battles consumed resources and manpower, Wilhelm stubbornly refused to acknowledge reality, ordering lavish military parades and extravagant court ceremonies even as German citizens faced hunger, shortages, and despair. The once invincible empire slowly buckled beneath economic strain, forced to borrow desperately, issue worthless bonds, and print money with reckless abandon, ultimately spiraling into inflationary ruin. Yet Wilhelm's extravagance never wavered, even as his empire tottered toward bankruptcy. He continued hosting elaborate banquets, commissioning expensive artworks, and lavishing enormous sums on uniforms, medals, and personal indulgences. His court remained a theater of absurd wealth, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the growing fury outside palace gates. Wilhelm, insulated by pride and arrogance, failed to recognize the storm clouds gathering, the resentment brewing among millions who blamed his imperial ambitions for their suffering. It was as though he believed money was limitless, power absolute, and privilege eternal dangerous illusions that history delights in disproving. In 1918, Wilhelm's illusions shattered abruptly. Defeated militarily and economically, Germany erupted into revolution, demanding immediate abdication. Wilhelm fled hastily, departing for the Netherlands, a refugee emperor stripped overnight of throne, authority, and most painfully, his imperial wealth. Suddenly, Wilhelm confronted a harsh new reality. Exile, poverty, and humiliation forced into reliance upon generosity rather than imperial entitlement. The man who had once commanded a vast empire now occupied a modest mansion in the Dutch countryside, forced to count carefully every guilder, aware of every painful transaction. Exile was profoundly difficult for Wilhelm, an emperor accustomed to unlimited resources and unquestioned authority. Though not entirely destitute, his personal wealth was drastically reduced, his property confiscated, and his formerly lavish lifestyle severely curtailed. He struggled bitterly with financial constraints, quietly selling possessions, paintings, heirlooms, even medals and royal decorations to sustain himself. Each sale was a humiliating reminder of his reduced status, a private admission that imperial privilege, once lost, is seldom recovered. Wilhelm's pride, however, remained stubbornly intact, even as he struggled with exile's humiliations. He hosted small gatherings and dinners, always careful to project an air of dignity and authority, though privately aware that his modest means belied appearances. Guests noted subtle economies, a dish repeated too often, furniture worn and hastily repaired, decorations fewer and less ornate. Wilhelm, ever conscious of appearances, endured quiet embarrassment, his outward bravado masking constant financial anxiety. He remained a proud emperor, even as circumstances stripped him steadily of wealth and dignity. The bitterest irony of Wilhelm's exile was perhaps that he, who had once considered money and privilege eternal, now obsessed quietly over financial minutiae. He argued frequently over bills, bickered with household servants over minor expenses, and watched every expense carefully. Money, once treated as inconsequential, became a constant preoccupation, a stark reminder of exile's harsh realities. Wilhelm, the man who had once commanded an empire's vast resources, now fretted over small debts and shrinking accounts, painfully aware of his vulnerability. Yet Wilhelm never fully accepted responsibility for his fall. Instead, he blamed ministers, generals, revolutionaries VIII, but himself for Germany's economic collapse and his personal ruin. In his bitterness, he refused to acknowledge how his own arrogance, extravagance, and stubborn blindness had hastened his downfall. He clung stubbornly to illusions of innocence and victimhood, forever convinced that he was betrayed rather than accountable. Privately, however, he suffered acutely, forever haunted by the contrast between his remembered imperial splendor and exile's stark austerity. Wilhelm's story thus became a poignant cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked pride, reckless extravagance, and royal blindness to economic realities. His exile underscored the cruel irony of privilege, how easily wealth and power, seemingly infinite, can disappear overnight, leaving even emperors to struggle with poverty and humiliation. His experience echoed the fates of countless royals who learned too late that authority without prudence and wealth without restraint are always temporary. But Wilhelm was hardly alone in his bitter exile. Across Europe, other monarchs were learning similar lessons, rulers whose wealth once seemed inexhaustible, whose power appeared eternal, yet whose final days would be spent quietly counting coins, forced into humility by economic ruin. Among them was an emperor whose brief, glittering reign ended in crushing defeat, whose dreams collapsed into debt, exile, and bitter regret, a leader whose fate mirrored Wilhelm's, a painful reminder that even imperial crowns cannot shield their wearers from financial reckoning and ruin. Emperor Napoleon III of France. Emperor Napoleon III began his reign with the promise of legacy. Not just a political one, but a familial echo, an attempt to recast the glory of his famous uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, into a more modern and seemingly civilized French Empire. He styled himself as both a man of the people and an imperial visionary, promising prosperity through progress, revolution tempered by order, and reform sweetened with luxury. But what followed was a reign marked by soaring ambition, fiscal illusion, and the slow disintegration of grandeur into debt, exile, and decline. From the outset, Napoleon III saw image as currency. He rebuilt Paris with the elegance of a man remodeling history. Broad boulevards, gaslit avenues, gilded architecture, the city became an imperial showcase, a stage upon which he could play the dual roles of benevolent emperor and architectural messiah. His investments in infrastructure, public works, and industry were monumental, often financed through massive state loans and optimistic forecasts. But optimism, like borrowed money, always has a limit. Napoleon's imperial vision came at a steep cost. The French treasury strained under the weight of endless renovations and military ventures. Wars in Italy, colonial escapades abroad, and costly entanglements drained the coffers faster than taxes could replenish them. And yet, he never stopped spending. Palaces gleamed, uniforms sparkled, and court life shimmered with theatrical abundance. He loved ceremony pageantry not as an accessory to rule, but as a core philosophy. His empire was built not only on railroads and reforms, but on chandeliers and embroidered chairs. But behind the glittering surface, cracks widened. The lower classes, promised opportunity and uplift, found themselves increasingly burdened by taxes and economic volatility. The middle class, initially seduced by promises of modernity, began to grow suspicious of the emperor's persistent borrowing and opaque finances. Debt was quietly mounting. The empire's economy, though outwardly stable, rested upon precarious assumptions and inflated confidence. But Napoleon, intoxicated by his own mythos and too insulated by luxury to hear the alarms, marched steadily toward disaster. Then came the war that would end everything. In 1870, Napoleon III launched an ill-advised conflict against Prussia, underestimating both the military strength of his enemy and the financial exhaustion of his own nation. The Franco-Prussian War was brief, brutal, and humiliating. French forces collapsed, and the emperor himself was captured at the Battle of Sedan. It was a moment of utter reversal on emperor, once surrounded by gold and flattery, reduced to a political liability in the hands of his enemies. Back in France, the Second Empire imploded almost instantly. Parisians, tired of imperial dreams turned debt-ridden nightmares, overthrew the regime with volcanic rage. Exiled to England, Napoleon III became simply Louis Napoleon once more. The grandeur, the palaces, the extravagant dinners, and the fine uniform beloved vanished like smoke in a gust of cold, historical wind. Settling in Chislehurst, Kent, he tried to maintain a semblance of dignity, but reality was unkind. No longer backed by the vast wealth of a national treasury, he was forced to live off private funds which, despite appearances, were surprisingly limited. The former emperor now counted coins instead of commanding armies. His exile was comfortable compared to some, yes, but in his mind, it was a devastating come-down. The man who had redesigned Paris was now wandering foreign gardens, writing bitter political tracts that few read, reflecting on a legacy slipping steadily into irrelevance. His wife, Empress Eugenie, watched silently as their wealth ebbed. Their social circle dwindled, and their lives became a quiet echo of a once imperial roar. Napoleon III never stopped longing for a return. He spoke often of France, of restoration, of redemption. But those dreams were mere vapor fantasies flickering in a modest English sitting room as unpaid bills arrived by post. He died in 1873 after a painful surgery. not in a palace surrounded by loyal courtiers, but in a rented house, his final breath rattling with the weight of broken promises and the rustle of empty pockets. His legacy? A war lost in weeks, an empire toppled in days, and a life that serves as one more cautionary parable in the gilded graveyard of fallen monarchsmen who believed themselves above the laws of money, time, and consequence. Napoleon III's fall reminds us that imperial image, however carefully staged, cannot mask the dangers of unchecked ambition and financial fantasy. And as his widow Eugenie mourned beside his modest grave, history had already moved on, preparing its next act. For far to the east, another empire colossal, cold and cracking, was on the verge of a similar descent. Its Tsar would face a darker fate. His debts written not in banknotes but in blood, his imperial illusions buried beneath the weight of revolution and the icy silence of a snowbound execution cellar. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. It takes a special kind of historical blindness to believe that a 300-year-old autocracy could be preserved by charm, candles, and prayer. But Nicholas VIII, Emperor of Russia, father of 5, lover of family portraits and holy mystics, believed exactly that. He ruled not with the iron discipline of Peter the Great or the ruthless cunning of Catherine, but with a gentleness that might have suited a provincial schoolmaster. His downfall wasn't merely a result of tyranny, it was, in many ways, the cost of gentleness paired with incompetence, reverence paired with avoidance, and, most dangerously, wealth paired with denial. From the outside, the Romanov world appeared impermeable. The Winter Palace dazzled in its Baroque pomp, while the imperial train steamed across half a continent like a locomotive throne. The Tsar's court moved to the rhythms of orthodox ritual and champagne toasts. There were diamonds, banquets, Fabergé egg-siege ornament, not just a luxury but a declaration that the empire would continue forever. And yet, under Nicholas's reign, these symbols grew hollow. The empire was bleeding, the economy was cracking, and the money, endless as it seemed, was running out. Nicholas inherited an empire already strained by rebellion and modernization. His father, Alexander III, had been an authoritarian, and Nicholas tried to follow in his shadow without inheriting any of his resolve. He resisted reforms that might have democratized the empire or modernized its economy. He clung instead to the illusion of divine right, the idea that God himself had appointed him to rule an empire that sprawled from Poland to the Pacific. This belief was convenient. It allowed Nicholas to float above practical concerns like budgets, infrastructure, or financial planning. But the empire was not floating. It was sinking, slowly and inexorably. The Russian economy, bloated by imperial overreach, could not keep pace with the demands of modernity. The cost of maintaining a massive peacetime army, funding the lavish court, and expanding industrial projects across Siberia drained the treasury. Then came the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, which ended in humiliation. That military debacle was both a blow to national pride and a hemorrhage of financial resources. The Tsar lost ships, soldiers, and billions of ruble sand, with them the confidence of his people. To offset the crisis, Russia borrowed heavily. International loans propped up the Tsar's spending, while domestic inequality ballooned. Aristocrats still feasted in dachas while peasants ate black bread in crumbling huts. Meanwhile, Nicholas poured money into religious monuments and personal indulgences, believing these symbolic acts would spiritually stabilize the nation. He clung to the trappings of wealth balls, ceremonies, portraits, while his empire staggered under the weight of unpaid debts and widespread hunger. Then came World War I, the fatal blow. Nicholas, ever eager to appear strong, led Russia into a war it was neither financially nor logistically prepared to fight. The costs were astronomical. Troop supply lines collapsed, inflation skyrocketed, and food riots erupted in the streets. The empire's already threadbare economy disintegrated. Nicholas's government printed money to pay for the war, triggering runaway inflation. By 1917, a loaf of bread cost a day's wages if you could find one. Through it all, Nicholas remained curiously detached. He spent increasing amounts of time with his family at Tsarskoye Selo, retreating from political life and leaving much of the government in the hands of his wife Alexandra and, through her, the infamous Rasputin. As ministers resigned and mutiny spread, the imperial couple prayed harder. But prayers don't pay soldiers, and spiritual certainty cannot fill a nation's stomach. In the 19th of February 17, the House of Cards collapsed. Nicholas was forced to abdicate, stunned and bewildered by the suddenness of it all. He and his family were placed under house arrest, first in the Alexander Palace and later in increasingly isolated residences. Their wealth-vast estates, jewels, art, and property was seized by the new provisional government, and later, the Bolsheviks. The Romanovs were stripped of titles, income, and dignity. The last Tsar, who had once overseen one of the wealthiest royal houses in the world, now lived on government rations, dependent on guards for toilet paper and sugar. Nicholas, who had once lived amid gold chandeliers and royal orchestras, spent his final months sweeping floors, chopping firewood, and pretending not to hear the guards laughing at him. His family sold what little they had. Brooches, toys, a gold cigarette case to afford small comforts during captivity. It was not merely exile, but a slow, grinding impoverishment designed to humiliate and erase. The imperial family was no longer royalty. They were inconvenient burdens to be disposed of quietly. In the 19th of July 18, they were murdered in a basement, not ceremoniously, not regally, but brutally shot, stabbed, and left in a shallow grave in a forest. The debts of the empire had come dueno, only fiscal but moral, spiritual, historical, and the cost was paid in silence and blood. Nicholas II's tragedy was not merely the collapse of an empire, but the slow, avoidable failure of a man who mistook wealth for stability, prayer for policy, and royal rituals for governance. His fall, like those before him, reminds us that no amount of opulence can hold back the flood when poverty, discontent, and revolution converge. And yet, even after such a cataclysmic fall, history did not tire of repeating itself. Far across the world, another emperor would soon find his own gilded palace turned into a prison, his once divine rule replaced by servitude, propaganda, and a broom. His story would prove even stranger. A boy, God-turned-puppet-turned-prisoner, a man who fell so far that he would one day sweep the streets he was born to rule. Emperor Puyi of China. If Nicholas II was the last Tsar of a dying empire, Puyi was the last emperor of a vanished world. His life was not a downfall, it was a long, surreal descent, a decades-spanning parable of the grotesque absurdity that follows when royalty is stripped of its meaning but forced to keep performing the ritual anyway. Puyi wasn't just dethroned, he was repurposed, humiliated, re-educated, and reshaped over and over until even he could no longer tell where the man ended and the puppet began. He was born into divine authority and died taking attendance in a botanical garden. But in between, the illusion of royalty lingered like smoke delicate, ornamental, and utterly useless. Crowned at the age of 2, Puyi never chose the throne. He merely inherited it like a ceremonial disease. He couldn't walk, couldn't read, couldn't even feed himself, yet he was considered the son of heaven, the supreme ruler of the Qing dynasty, or rather, of what was left of it. By 1908, the imperial court was a paper palace, ornate but empty, pretending to rule a China that had already begun fracturing under the weight of modernity, rebellion, and colonial pressure. Puyi's reign was more performance than power, his childhood shaped not by warmth or education, but by protocol, eunuchs, and paranoia. He lived in the Forbidden City, but the doors had already begun to swing open. In 1912, revolution finally swept through, and 6-year-old Puyi abdicated. Sort of. In a peculiar compromise that only imperial decline can produce, the young emperor was allowed to stay in the Forbidden City, nominally as a sovereign, practically as a decorative hostage. He lived on a generous government stipend, surrounded by rituals that had lost their meaning and servants who no longer believed in their roles. For over a decade, Puyi lived in a surreal bublano, longer emperor, but not quite a citizen either. A royal ghost haunting the hollowed-out halls of a palace-turned-museum. During this limbo, money flowed but meaning did not. The Chinese government continued paying him a stipend in gold and silver, enough to keep up appearances but never enough to restore power. Puyi indulged in petty luxuries, British tutors, silk robes, foreign cigarettes, and endless attempts to recreate a vanished court. He spent extravagantly, childishly, as though ritual could reanimate authority. The money slipped through his fingers like water, used not for investment or foresight, but for preserving the illusion that he was still, in some abstract way, important. Eventually, even the illusion collapsed. In 1924, warlords expelled Puyi from the Forbidden City for good. His imperial stipend ended, his titles were stripped, and the final locks on the ancient palace clicked shut behind him. He drifted through foreign hotels and rented homes, now entirely dependent on dwindling family funds and foreign benefactors who were more interested in exploiting his symbolic value than preserving his dignity. The man who had once ruled all under heaven found himself negotiating with bellhops over room service bills. But the cruelest chapter was yet to come. In the 1930s, the Japanese, seeking a puppet for their colonial project in Manchuria, resurrected Puyi as the emperor of the new state of Manchukuo. It was a hollow title, a charade dressed up in medals and pageantry. Puyi lived in a palace again, yes, but under constant surveillance. Japanese handlers dictated everything: his schedule, his meals, his speeches, even his wardrobe. He signed laws he didn't write and saluted generals he didn't command. It was royal theater with a hostage protagonist. He had servants and ceremonies, but no authority, no wealth of his own, and not even the right to refuse. When Japan fell in 1945, so did Puyi's last illusion. Captured by Soviet forces, he was imprisoned, interrogated, and eventually handed back to the newly formed People's Republic of China. Now, he became a tool of re-education, a living example of what happened to those who clung to the feudal past. He spent nearly a decade in a prison-turned-reform institute, where he was forced to recite Maoist slogans, clean latrines, and confess his imperial crimes in front of jeering crowds. There were no palaces now, no stipends, no robes-just gray uniforms, cold floors, and state-sponsored humiliation. And then, astonishingly, he was released. In his final years, Puyi lived as a simple citizen in Beijing, working as a gardener and archivist, tending flowers in a botanical garden that once belonged to his ancestors. He was assigned a modest salary, shared a small apartment, and lined up for rations like everyone else. His wealth, his authority, his royal identity, they had all been stripped away, layer by layer, until nothing remained but a quiet man who once sat on a dragon throne and now watered tulips under a red flag. Puyi's life is not just the story of financial ruin, it is the story of the absurd afterlife of monarchy in the modern world. He was the last emperor of China, but also its first royal janitor. And in the end, perhaps that was the point. History, unlike emperors, doesn't believe in divine right. It believes in irony. And while Puyi pruned trees once planted by men who called themselves immortal, across the sea, another imperial figure, the last of a dynasty, not unlike his own, would soon experience a softer, subtler, but no less devastating decline. Stripped of power, adrift in Europe, and forced to pawn fragments of his imperial past just to buy time, he too would learn the quiet horror of being a monarch without a kingdom and a man without a fortune. Emperor Bao Dai of Vietnam. In the long, humid twilight of French Indochina, Emperor Bao Dai stood as a strangely modern monarch educated in Paris, fluent in colonial etiquette, and perpetually caught between two worlds that would never reconcile. He was Vietnam's last emperor, a man raised in silk and sent off to Europe to be polished like a diamond, only to return to a fractured homeland whose people no longer believed in the illusion of monarchy. His reign was a series of half-gestures, neither truly sovereign nor truly free, neither adored nor entirely despised. But what he lost in power, he tried to cushion with luxury, retreating into decadence as his nation bled out beneath him. Born in Phuc Vern Thuy, Bao Dai became emperor at the age of 12, after the death of his father, a poetic coronation that meant little in practice. The French, who ruled Vietnam as part of their colonial empire, kept the real power securely locked away behind bureaucrats and soldiers. Bao Dai was less a ruler than a living symbol and ornament affixed to a crumbling edifice. When he returned from years of education in France, he did so wearing tailored suits and French cologne, fluent in European cynicism, and almost absurdly detached from the realities of Vietnamese life under colonial rule. His palace life was equal parts European salon and Eastern theater. He rode horses, dined on imported delicacies, smoked filtered cigarettes, and practiced the studied aloofness of a man trained to live in comfort while pretending to rule. His court was more concerned with formality than governance, more silk robes and ceremonial bows than policymaking or reform. And while his people starved, resisted, and quietly organized, Bao Dai retreated into the warm bath of privilege. Yet beneath the silk veneer, his empire was evaporating. Vietnam was convulsing under occupation, then war, then division. The Japanese displaced the French during World War II, only to be driven out themselves by the Allies, which led to a brief and hollow restoration of Bao Dai's title. But by then, nationalism was no longer a murmur, it was a roar. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh rose from the shadows with revolutionary fervor, preaching independence, socialism, and the end of monarchy. In 1945, sensing the inevitable, Bao Dai abdicated the throne, hoping to escape with dignity. He traded his imperial seal for a role as citizen Vern Thuy, hoping perhaps that history would give him a soft landing. But monarchy doesn't grant parachutes. In the years that followed, Bao Dai tried repeatedly to return to power, each time with less authority, more absurdity, and greater financial strain. He allowed himself to be installed as chief of state by the French in 1949, a puppet ruler in a puppet government, an emperor in name only. And though he tried to present himself as a modern leader, posing with diplomats, speaking of reform, he spent most of his time in casinos, seaside villas, and French resorts, squandering what little remained of his political capital on champagne and women. With each failed political comeback, his finances grew more desperate. He sold personal property, haggled quietly with former supporters, and liquidated family assets to maintain the illusion of relevance. In exile, he drifted from Paris to the Riviera, always dressed impeccably, always cash-strapped. He became a figure of tragic Farcian emperor who ruled nothing, dependent on fading connections and dwindling wealth, quietly pawning pieces of his royal inheritance to fund vacations he could no longer afford. His life was a slow-motion unraveling. He had no real estate empire, no loyal exile government, no underground network of revolutionaries. He had only memories of coronations, processions, gold-threaded robes, and the bitterness of a man raised to rule who was never allowed to. Toward the end of his life, Bao Dai was so broke that he resorted to selling his cars, watches, and even ceremonial swords items that once symbolized power, now reduced to collateral for temporary survival. The velvet rope of royalty had been lowered for good. He died in Paris in 1997, nearly anonymous. No state funeral, no great mourning procession, no imperial anthem played for the man who had once been the Son of Heaven. His death was noted, but not mourned. In Vietnam, his name had become little more than a footnote, a memory of compromise and quiet failure, of champagne-scented betrayal. His palace had become a museum. His throne, a curiosity. His fortune dissolved. Bao Dai's story is less about dramatic collapse and more about chronic erosion, the slow, irreversible leaking of relevance, respect, and resources. He didn't fall from grace. He wandered gently away from it, distracted by women, dice, and the sound of clinking glasses. And yet, for all its pathos, his life remains one of the clearest parables of imperial decay. A ruler without a realm, a royal born into theater, eventually reduced to props and costumes he could no longer afford. But Bao Dai's story was not the final echo. Another monarch, dethroned centuries earlier, would come to embody an older flavor of royal exileless, elegant, more tragica Catholic king of Protestant England, who lost not only his throne but every coin in his pocket, clinging not to luxury, but to borrowed dignity in a country that found him both useless and unwelcome. King James II of England. King James II never fully understood England. He understood the divine right of kings, the sanctity of Catholicism, the glint of royal armor on a battlefield, but not the mood of his people, nor the practical constraints of ruling a nation increasingly suspicious of both papal influence and royal absolutism. By the time he ascended the throne in 1685, England had already endured a civil war, a regicide, a commonwealth, and a reluctant restoration. It had become a country that liked its monarch seen, not heard and certainly not governing by divine decree, while trying to reinstate popery by stealth. But James, stubborn, devout, and financially naive, tried to do exactly that. The result was swift, spectacular, and for him, economically catastrophic. From the beginning, James was an expensive man with impractical ambitions. He believed kings should rule by will, not by budget. Like his brother Charles II, James enjoyed the grandeur of monarchite palaces, the feasts, the rows of liveried servants, the carriages trimmed in gold, but unlike Charles, he lacked the wit to keep Parliament on his side or creditors from circling too close. His Catholicism made him an object of suspicion, his policies made him unpopular, and his spending habits made him perpetually short of money. Royal revenue, never stable even in good times, began to buckle under the weight of military buildup, court extravagance, and religious propaganda disguised as political policy. When the Glorious Revolution arrived in 1688, it did not explode with violence but drifted in like a fog quiet, calculated and utterly decisive. William of Orange, invited by Protestant nobles, landed with Dutch troops in polite menace. James, realizing too late that the political winds had permanently shifted, attempted a few hollow gestures of resistance before trying to flee the country entirely. He was caught once, humiliated, and then quietly allowed to escape on a second attempt, as if the country was simply too embarrassed to stage another execution. His own daughter and son-in-law had effectively deposed him, and England let him go with a collective sigh of exhausted irritation. He washed ashore in France, stripped of his throne and possessions, but still wrapped tightly in the belief that he was, in the eyes of heaven, the true king. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, offered him refuge more as an act of Catholic solidarity and a political jab at England than out of personal affection. James was given a pension and the use of the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a once grand royal residence now retrofitted as a gilded holding pen for royal cast-offs. From the outside, it looked like luxury. Inside, it was a prison of velvet-lined disappointment. James quickly learned that French hospitality came with limits. Louis's support was not unconditional, and the pension was modest, certainly not enough to maintain the vast entourage, ceremonial court, and royal trappings James insisted upon preserving. Ever clinging to the illusion of return, he kept up the performance of kingship with increasing desperation. Exiled courtiers played along, eating sparsely at candlelit dinners while James gave sermons about divine destiny. He issued declarations, held audiences, and gave ceremonial blessings, all while quietly selling personal effects to pay for bread, candles, and heating. Worse still, he refused to scale down. Pride prevented him from acknowledging that his throne was truly lost, and with it the financial machinery that once sustained him. The crown jewels had been left behind, English estates were confiscated. Revenue from the Church of England, once a personal cash machine, was now firmly in the hands of his Protestant replacements. The Stuart treasury, always fragile, was empty. And yet James continued to live as if a sudden reversal of fortune was just around the corner. He became a relic in exile, a king with a court but no courtier, a monarch with rituals but no subjects. His French allowance barely covered expenses, and his letters to supporters increasingly carried the tone of a beggar disguised as a prophet. Appeals for funds were wrapped in theological certainty, but it was hard to ignore the undertone of economic desperation. He asked not just for prayers, but for coins. By the end, James was less emperor in exile than disappointed patriarch, wandering the corridors of Saint-Germain in a robe worn too thin, surrounded by exiled Jacobites still pretending that any day now, a fleet would sail from France, a rebellion would rise in England, and God would deliver him back to Whitehall. But God was silent, Parliament was not, and the exchequer remained closed. James II died in 1701. In France, in exile, in debt, and in delusion. His tomb was modest, his funeral funded by the very monarchs he once considered usurpers. His life had been a royal parable of conviction without calculation, ambition without allies, and faith without a budget. He proved, once again, that divine right doesn't pay rent, and that kings, like commoners, must eventually face the arithmetic of reality. But even James's melancholy exile would pale in comparison to another Bourbon monarch who followed him into the shadows of Histoire King, who wore the crown of France until the July sun boiled over in revolution, and who spent his final days not in defiant grandeur, but in stripped-down retirement, a relic of monarchy slowly wasting away, counting down his days in quiet, subsidized dignity. King Charles X of France. To watch a monarchy die twice in one lifetime is a uniquely cruel fate, But Charles X of France managed it with all the tragic dignity of a man who believed that time owed him something. He was the last Bourbon king to rule France, a monarch so deeply devoted to the divine right of kings that he tried to resurrect the Ancien Regime 50 years after it had been decapitated. It did not go well. The result was a royal style built on powdered wigs and empty pockets, a reign of creaking nostalgia financed by national exhaustion, and, ultimately, a long, bitter exile paid for with charity and quiet desperation. Charles had been exiled before. As the younger brother of Louis XVI, he had fled France during the Revolution, watching the world he was born to rule get ripped apart by mobs and guillotines. While others adapted, Charles remained obstinately frozen in time, clinging to the pomp, language, and theology of a world that no longer existed. He spent years bouncing between European courts, a royal vagabond surviving on the generosity of monarchs more politically agile than himself. He lived in foreign castles and borrowed chateaux, polishing the idea of restoration like a precious relic, convinced that France would eventually realize how wrong it had been to execute kings and flirt with equality. That chance finally came in 1814, when Napoleon's empire collapsed and the Bourbon monarchy was restored. Charles's older brother, Louis XVIII, took the throne first, ruling with a thin veneer of constitutional moderation. But when Louis died in 1824, Charles inherited the crown and promptly set about dragging France backward into the 18th century like a man who finds a broken clock and insists it must still be right because it once was. Charles immediately began handing out compensation to nobles who had lost property during the Revolution, lavish gifts drawn from a national treasury already wobbling under debt. He elevated clergy, restored church privileges, and tried to reintroduce harsh censorship laws. He treated the French Constitution as an irritating suggestion, not a legal constraint. He surrounded himself with ultra-royalists and acted less like a king of modern France and more like a divine relic on loan from Versailles. To Charles, monarchy wasn't about governing, it was about being obeyed, celebrated, and eternally honored. But France had changed. It was a country of lawyers, journalists, and middle-class industrialists, now not powdered courtiers and fawning bishops. Charles's nostalgia curdled into unpopularity, and his extravagant style only made things worse. His court burned through money as if revolution were a distant memory, not a recurring national habit. Public funds vanished into royal pageants, clerical pensions, and counter-revolutionary projects. Every lavish spectacle became a reminder of how disconnected he was from the realities of modern governance. Every economic downturn became fuel for Republican fury. In the 18th of July 30, the pressure finally exploded. Charles issued the July Ordinance as an astonishing act of political tone-deafness that suspended the freedom of the press, dissolved the legislature, and effectively declared himself an absolute monarch again. The reaction was immediate. Paris erupted in riots. The tricolor flag returned, and barricades filled the streets. Within days, Charles fled abdicating in favor of his grandson, a maneuver so desperate it fooled no one. His second exile was even more humiliating than the first. No longer a young man with hope and allies, Charles was now an old king with no country and limited funds. He crossed into England, where the British crown, with a blend of politeness and quiet pity, offered him a place to stay. He lived off a pension scraped together by loyalists and foreign sympathizers, forced to downsize both his lifestyle and his expectations. From the gilded palaces of Paris, he had been reduced to borrowed rooms and awkward dinners, relying on the goodwill of other monarchs to maintain a shadow of his former dignity. Gone were the grand entourage, the gold-encrusted coaches, the endless retinue of yes-men and ministers. His court in exile was small and modest, more a social club of bitter royalists than a government in waiting. Charles spent his days reflecting, praying, and failing to reconcile his beliefs with the world that had so thoroughly rejected them. He never gave up his claim to the throne, but he also never made a serious attempt to reclaim it. Pride kept him dreaming. Reality kept him grounded. When he died in 1836, in the fated Palazzo of Gorizia in the Austrian Empire, it was far from the marble tombs of Saint Denis. There was no national mourning, no return of the Bourbon standard. He was buried quietly, without fanfare, in foreign soil, a king remembered not for heroism or reform, but for his refusal to learn anything from history except how to repeat its worst parts. His financial legacy was just as ignoble. Debts, unpaid pensions, and court officials still submitting expense reports to a crown that no longer existed. Charles X proved that nostalgia is a terrible financial strategy. His life was a testament to the cost of stubborn belief in a dead system, a portrait of royal decline painted in the faded colors of borrowed time and dwindling fortunes. But even in his faded twilight, Charles cast a long shadow that would fall across another French king who came after him, a monarch who tried, like Charles, to bridge the gap between modern politics and royal vanity, and who, like Charles, would find himself fleeing Paris, crown in hand, dignity in tatters, and his fortune hemorrhaging into the cold exile of history. King Louis Philippe of France. If Charles X was the ghost of the Ancien Regime, then Louis Philippe was its awkward afterlife. Styled as the citizen king, he rose to power not on the backs of nobles but on the shoulders of bourgeois optimisme, a man, supposedly modern, pragmatic, and tuned to the rhythms of post-revolutionary France. He wore trousers instead of breeches, carried an umbrella like a proper Parisian, and spoke of the people with the fluency of someone who had once been forced to hide among them. But beneath his plain attire and liberal facade lay the soul of a conservative monarch, a man whose instinct for self-preservation eventually outpaced his sense of justice, and whose personal fortune swelled just as his political capital ran dry. He had once been in exile himself. After the execution of his father, Philippe Égalité, during the French Revolution, young Louis Philippe fled France and wandered Europe for decades, living modestly, even teaching in Switzerland under a false name. These were lean years, sometimes humiliating ones, and they left him with a keen awareness of money's value. When he finally returned to power in 1830, taking the throne after Charles X's graceless abdication, he came back with a determination to never be poor again. His reign was a study in paradox, a king who claimed to serve the people, but who spent the next 18 years quietly securing a fortune so vast that it would, for a time, rival the very state he ruled. Louis Philippe styled his monarchy as constitutional, but in practice it was a slow drift back into autocracy dressed in bourgeois camouflage. While he avoided the Baroque excesses of his predecessors, he compensated in private. He diverted state funds, engaged in murky real estate schemes, and used political appointments to enrich his family's holdings. The Orleans fortune, already considerable, grew into something monstrous under his stewardship, and yet, ironically, the more wealth he accumulated, the less legitimacy he retained. The people saw through him. The press ridiculed his penny-pinching persona and mocked the contrast between his supposed modesty and his actual accumulation of assets. He became a caricature, the king who counted coins while pretending to count votes. As inequality rose, strikes surged, and Republicans sharpened their rhetoric, Louis Philippe tightened the reins, restricting suffrage and ignoring pleas for reform. His financial prudence, once admired, came to symbolize a cold detachmenta king not above corruption, but utterly steeped in it. By 1848, the dam broke. Economic downturns, food shortages, and waves of unemployment collided with political stagnation, and the February Revolution swept across Paris like a long-awaited thunderstorm. Crowds filled the streets, barricades were raised, and the king, 74 years old and increasingly brittle, realized that his carefully built fortress of property and policy was nothing but papier-mâché in the face of real anger. He abdicated in haste, naming his 9-year-old grandson as successor, then fled the country in disguise, reportedly dressed as Mr. Smith, clutching a cane and a lifetime's worth of financial security packed into his luggage. In exile, Louis-Philippe settled in England, of course. Where else? Joining the long line of dethroned monarchs politely accommodated by the British crown. He took up residence at Claremont House, a stately manor lent to him by Queen Victoria, whose sympathy for the old king was perhaps matched only by her relief that she didn't have to rule his country. On the surface, Claremont was genteel, comfortable, refined, but for a man who had once controlled France and its treasury, it was a velvet coffin, a soft, quiet place to wait out the end. Watching the fortune he had hoarded gradually wither under the weight of legal entanglements, family disputes, and the slow erosion of relevance. The Orleans fortune, frozen by the new republic, became a source of protracted legal agony. His sons fought to reclaim assets, lands, and rents, but the once vast empire of wealth became increasingly fragmented. Louis-Philippe himself, once obsessive about saving and investing, now found his days consumed by paperwork, lawyers, and the slow bureaucratic grind of international asset recovery. And while he was never destitute, the lifestyle he had crafted the polished veneer of royal frugality masking aggressive accumulation became a hollow echo in exile. There were no more dividends of power, only the shrinking interest of wealth without a throne. He died in 1850, just 2 years after fleeing Paris, in a foreign land, surrounded by family and regrets. His funeral was quiet, his name already fading from the French consciousness. In a cruel twist, the citizen king had become exactly what he once claimed to despise: a deposed monarch, clinging to symbols of authority that no longer mattered. His wealth, once so carefully curated, could not buy back time, legitimacy, or affection. Louis Philippe's exile was less dramatic than some Mino executions. No gulags, no riots outside his windows, but it was every bit as complete. He was a king turned landlord, a statesman turned accountant, measuring his days not in decrees, but in letters from notaries and bank statements marked insufficient funds. And as his children continued to bicker over inheritance and history turned its gaze elsewhere, France moved on to its next imperial experimentone that would bring back the Bonaparte name, gamble everything on glory, and collapse, once again, into exile and unpaid debts. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. If royal exile is a tragic genre, then Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico was its most exotic chapter, a Habsburg prince turned puppet sovereign who mistook theatrical splendor for legitimacy and found, too late, that empires built on delusion collapse with real bullets. His story is one of misguided grandeur, financial disaster, and colonial farce wrapped in military tragedy. He was an emperor crowned in the wrong country, at the wrong time, with the wrong allies, and he paid for the mistake with everything he had. Born into the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Habsburg dynasty, Maximilian had all the makings of a royal second son. Cultured, romantic, somewhat naive, and dangerously idealistic. He spoke multiple languages, adored botany, and believed earnestly in enlightened monarchy. He also believed, rather fatally, that good intentions and impeccable manners could stabilize nations. When the French, under Napoleon III, offered him the Mexican throne in 1864, conveniently during a European-backed intervention to reshape Mexico's politics and debt structure, Maximilian accepted with a sense of divine mission and a love for Baroque pageantry. He should have known better. Mexico, at the time, was deeply fractured. Years of civil war had left the nation politically exhausted, economically devastated, and profoundly divided between conservatives, who wanted monarchy and order, and liberals, who wanted a republic and reform. Into this chaos, Maximilian arrived in a French warship no less, draped in velvet and crowned with European ceremony, as though he were entering a Viennese ballroom rather than a nation that had no real interest in wearing another man's crown. From the beginning, Maximilian's imperial project was a theater of financial ruin. Mexico's treasury was threadbare, its infrastructure shattered, and its loyalties bought rather than earned. Maximilian, committed to upholding European standards of imperial grandeur, poured money his own, what little was raised from Mexican taxes, and what Napoleon III supplied into transforming the capital. He refurbished Chapultepec Castle into a neoclassical palace, imported carriages, uniforms, artworks, and furniture from Europe, and attempted to create a court worthy of Vienna in the dusty hills above Mexico City. His budget was not just strained, it was absurd. Worse, Maximilian's policies alienated both factions. Conservatives grew disillusioned when he upheld liberal reforms, such as land redistribution and the abolition of peasant servitude. Liberals, led by the exiled but indomitable Benito Juarez, saw him as a foreign invader propped up by European muskets. Maximilian found himself alone, a monarch without a base, a sovereign whose authority existed only within the radius of foreign troops, and even they were on loan. Napoleon III, facing diplomatic pressure and domestic unease, began to withdraw French military support in 1866. The empire Maximilian had so meticulously imagined crumbled almost immediately. His treasury was empty. His army, a patchwork of foreign mercenaries and unreliable locals, began to fall apart. Loans couldn't be repaid. Suppliers stopped supplying. Even his personal staff went unpaid. The court that once sparkled with imported crystal and Austrian etiquette now whispered of bankruptcy and mutiny. Maximilian could have fled. His wife, Carlota, had already returned to Europe in a fit of despair, but he stayed, believing nobly and naively in honor. He was captured in 1867 after a brief, hopeless military stand in Querétaro. The trial that followed was brutal, swift, and final. Despite international outcry and pleas from European royalty, Juarez refused to pardon him. He was executed by firing squad on the 19th of June, wearing a black suit and repeating, "Viva Mexico," as the shots rang out. His imperial dream ended not with a coronation, but with the dull echo of bullets on a hill where no one had ever wanted a Habsburg throne in the first place. Financially, Maximilian died with virtually nothing. What had begun as a lavish imperial experiment ended in unpayable debts and abandoned palaces. The European loans that had bankrolled his regime became burdens Mexico would carry for years. His legacy, in monetary terms, was a ledger of unpaid bills, melted ornaments, and vanished grandeur. The jewels brought from Vienna were sold. The uniforms were moth-eaten. The gilded carriages were scrapped for parts. Even the furniture disappeared into auctions or was looted by victorious Republican forces. Maximilian's story is almost too poetic to be real. A romantic idealist lured across the ocean by the illusion of empire, who mistook pageantry for policy and destiny for debt. His downfall was not just personal, it was symbolic of every failed colonial fantasy, every crown placed on the wrong head in the wrong country. He ruled a kingdom that never truly existed, financed by promises that never matured, and was buried far from home, penniless, a cautionary tale carved in marble. But Maximilian was not alone in being undone by idealism and insolvency. Further east, another royal, figureless theatrical, but equally doomed, would one day be cast out of his Balkan palace. He too dreamed of progress, but governed amid chaos, and when his time came to leave, he carried with him little more than a ruined reputation and a suitcase packed by history's cold indifference. King Otto of Greece. King Otto of Greece arrived not as a savior, but as a compromise delivered to the weary, debt-ridden Greek people like a wedding gift from Europe they hadn't asked for and couldn't afford to return. A Bavarian prince with no connection to the language, culture, or chaotic politics of the region, Otto was handed the Greek crown by a committee of European powers in 1832, after the Greek War of Independence had ended the centuries-long Ottoman rule. The offer, on paper, seemed noble. But as always in royal appointments arranged by foreign diplomats, the devil came dressed in lace, epaulets, and unfunded expectations. Otto was just 17 when he took the throne, arriving in Greece flanked by German advisors, foreign architects, and imported court etiquette. The new king couldn't speak Greek. He issued proclamations in German. He built palaces in neoclassical style, borrowed from Bavaria, and ran his court like a transplanted European duchy complete, with stiff uniforms, imported wines, and ceremonial horses ill-suited to the rocky Greek terrain. From the beginning, Otto ruled not as a king of the people, but as a borrowed idea of monarchy imposed from abroad. A placeholder, crowned by committee. The money problem started early and never stopped. Greece, recently emerged from revolution, was broker-ravaged by war, starved of infrastructure and teetering under crushing debt. The great powers who had installed Otto, Britain, France, and Russia, had also extended massive loans to stabilize the fledgling state. These loans, while theoretically generous, were also absurdly optimistic. Otto was expected to build roads, establish order, and modernize a country with no tax base, no banking system, and barely a functioning bureaucracy. Instead, much of the foreign aid vanished into ceremonial projects, lavish palatial constructions, and the bottomless cost of maintaining a Bavarian-style court in a deeply impoverished land. Otto spent as if he ruled Vienna. His kingdom, however, looked more like a smoldering province of a forgotten empire. Every royal gesturia marble staircase here, a new cathedral there felt, less like progress and more like performance, paid for with IOUs signed in foreign capitals. The Greek people, fiercely proud and recently freed from foreign domination, were unimpressed by their imported monarch. They saw a man who ruled by fiat, who brought with him foreign officials and seemed indifferent to local needs. Discontent brewed. Revolts flared up in the provinces. The press, nascent but emboldened, began publishing biting criticisms. Otto, trained in obedience and ceremony, responded the only way he knew. He tightened control, invoked censorship, and clung to his rituals like they were life rafts in a rising tide. Eventually, even his international backers began to lose patience. The Greek economy remained stagnant, unable to repay its debts, and Otto's government was increasingly viewed as an expensive failure. He refused to adopt a constitution until 1843, when a military revolt forced his hand. By then, the goodwill that might have accompanied reform had long since curdled. The monarchy survived, but its credibility and its budget was in tatters. And then there was the matter of succession. Otto and his wife, Queen Amalia, had no children. The absence of an heir created further instability as political factions prepared for the inevitable collapse of the dynasty. Otto tried to placate them with infrastructure projects, royal appearances, and grand proclamations, but none of these things could be paid for. Loans defaulted, salaries went unpaid. Government operations ground to a halt. The monarchy was now not just unpopular, it was functionally insolvent. In 1862, Otto was finally deposed in a bloodless coup while away from the capital. He boarded a British warship, not as a ruler, but as a dismissed guest. Exiled back to Bavaria, he lived out his remaining years in retirement, technically still styling himself King of Greece, though no one least of all the Greeks took that title seriously. He died in 1867, financially strained, kept afloat by the private wealth of his extended family, but bereft of the power, influence, or relevance that had once accompanied his title. Otto's story is a peculiar flavor of royal ruin, not one of decadence or bloodshed, but of quiet failure. A well-intentioned monarch who arrived with no real power, ruled with no real support, and left with nothing but unredeemed debt and polite regrets. His reign was a ceremonial loan that never matured, an imported institution that never took root. And yet Otto was far from alone. The continent was littered with monarchs who learned that ruling by divine right is one thing, but ruling without funds is quite another. Not far to the north, a queen who had once commanded attention across Europe would meet a similarly poetic, declinian, eccentric monarch who abandoned her crown in pursuit of personal freedom, only to find herself chasing creditors across foreign courts, forced to barter her past for fleeting comfort. Queen Christina of Sweden. Few monarchs have ever walked away from power with such theatrical flair or such financial wreckage as Queen Christina of Sweden. She didn't just abdicate her throne, she exited it like a character in an opera, swathed in scandal, draped in velvet, and humming the overture to her own myth. Hers is the rare story of a queen who gave up one of Europe's most powerful Protestant thrones, not for love, nor revolution, nor military defeat, but for personal liberty and, of all things, Catholicism. She traded crown for conscience, governance for freedom, and, in doing so, she also traded solvency for a life spent dodging debt like a monarch on the run. Christina ascended the Swedish throne in 1632 at the age of 6, following the death of her father, Gustavus Adolphus, in battle. She was raised like a prince, educated in Latin, politics, philosophy, and warfare, trained to rule not as a queen consort, but as a sovereign in her own right. When she officially took power in her late teens, the Swedish Empire was at its zenith, flush with military victories and territorial gains from the 30 Years' War. The treasury was not exactly overflowing, but the state was stable. It didn't take long for Christina to put her own signature on the crown and to begin unraveling its finances in the process. She was brilliant, eccentric, and catastrophically impractical. Christina surrounded herself with artists, philosophers, poets, and scholars, modeling her court not on military order but on a sort of intellectual salon. She imported culture like it was an exotic fruit. French paintings, Italian music, Dutch books, ancient manuscripts. If it sparkled with European prestige, she wanted it. She hosted thinkers like René Descartes, who promptly died in the Swedish winter, and she poured royal funds into her library, theater, and art collections with little concern for cost. It was a golden age of culture and a silver age of national panic. Her court became notorious for its extravagance. She commissioned lavish costumes, built elaborate palaces, and threw grand spectacles that seemed more suited to Renaissance Florence than Lutheran Stockholm. The aristocracy grumbled. The clergy raised their eyebrows. And the treasury? The treasury buckled under the weight of her expenses. Christina raided crown lands, pawned state assets, and borrowed heavily, often in her own name, to finance her version of enlightened monarchy. The Swedish economy, still recovering from decades of war, could not keep up with her appetites. Then came the shock. In 1654, at the age of 27, Christina abdicated the throne. Officially, she cited physical exhaustion. Unofficially, she was fleeing from expectation, gender roles, and religious orthodoxy. She converted to Catholicism, an unthinkable act for a Scandinavian monarch, and left Sweden entirely, traveling incognito through Europe dressed in men's clothes, determined to live life on her own terms. She had inherited a kingdom, and she exchanged it for an identity. But personal freedom came at a steep cost. Now, without a state salary, Christina was forced to fund her lifestyle with a dwindling purse and a famously loose grip on money. She moved from Rome to France to Brussels to Innsbruck, always trailed by creditors and unpaid bills. The Vatican, fascinated by her royal pedigree and dramatic conversion, offered her a modest pension, but it was nowhere near enough to maintain the grandeur she insisted upon. She continued to commission art, sponsor musicians, and host intellectuals, all while ducking rent payments and arguing over loans. At times, she was forced to sell jewels and heirlooms just to pay her household staff. Her servants went months without pay. She borrowed money from cardinals, nobles, and former allies, often promising repayment from imagined sources. Christina, who had once ruled an empire, now ruled a court of borrowed time and bankrolled performances. Her reputation soured. Rumors circulated of her debts, her temper, her frequent flouting of etiquette. And yet, she retained a certain mystique, brilliant, broken figure, too proud to live modestly and too cash-strapped to live honestly. Even in her final years, Christina kept up the charade. She lived in a Roman palazzo filled with dusty books, half-paid scholars, and more illusion than furniture. Her finances were a tangle of promises and IOUs, and though she died in relative comfort in 1689, her estate was a wreck. Creditors lined up at her deathbed like mourners at a funeral, each hoping to recover a sliver of what they'd lost. Most never saw a coin. Her possessions were auctioned off. The libraries she'd curated, the art she'd cherished, the symbols of her enlightened rule, all sold to cover the expenses of a life lived beyond its means. Christina's life is the definition of royal irony. She gave up a crown to live freely, only to become enslaved by the very indulgences she refused to relinquish. She sought liberation, but stumbled into lifelong dependence on the benevolence of popes, princes, and polite creditors. Hers was not a fall from grace, but a descent into endless negotiation, queen without a kingdom, a patron without a purse. And yet, she was only one in a long line of monarchs who believed that image could substitute for income. Even back in Britain, where the monarchy had already learned the painful costs of civil war and rebellion, a certain king continued to spend like Versailles was just down the road. He kept tailors in business and jewelers rich, all while Parliament sighed audibly and creditors began to circle. A sovereign whose debts would become legendary not because he couldn't pay, but because he never stopped borrowing. King George IV of the United Kingdom. King George IV never met a mirror he didn't admire, a tailor he didn't overpay, or a budget he didn't immediately ignore. Before he was a king, he was a prince, drowning in velvet embroidered, perfumed, corseted, and catastrophically overdrawn. By the time he officially took the throne in 1820, following a lengthy term as Prince Regent during his father's mental decline, George had already transformed royal indebtedness into a personal art form. His reign wasn't simply marked by opulence, it was defined by the fiscal wreckage left in its wake. He was a man who styled himself as a connoisseur of beauty, architecture, clothing, women, and alcohol. But more than anything, George IV adored himself. His vanity was near operatic. His wardrobe was legendary: over 10,000 shirts, a mountain of waistcoats, an army of cravats, and boots polished to blinding perfection. His wigs alone could fill a ballroom. His mirrors were polished as meticulously as his public image, and both required constant maintenance. But image costs money, and George, in a manner that would echo through the halls of royal bankruptcy forever, was not interested in restraint. As Prince of Wales, he received an annual allowance from Parliament, £50,000 at first, later increased but blew through it with astonishing speed. By 1795, he had accumulated debts of nearly £630,000, an astronomical sum for the time, equivalent to tens of millions today. When Parliament balked at increasing his stipend yet again, he threatened to abandon royal duties altogether. Eventually, they caved, reluctantly agreeing to pay off his debts in exchange for his marrying his cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. It was a terrible deal for both George and Caroline. The marriage was a disaster, a ceremonial farce from the beginning. He was drunk at the altar and hated her by the end of the wedding night. They separated almost immediately, but George's spending didn't. He continued to pour money into his greatest passion project, the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a sprawling architectural fever dream that mashed together Indian, Chinese, and Regency styles in a gloriously incoherent display of wealth. The pavilion's onion domes, gilded dragons, and ornate chandeliers became a monument not to national pride or royal responsibility, but to one man's refusal to live within his means. His extravagance extended to the arts, furnishings, and culinary excess. The kitchens at Carlton House served upwards of 30 courses for a standard dinner. He commissioned paintings, sculptures, and jewel-encrusted furniture, most of which he admired privately and then stashed in rooms so numerous that even his servants lost track. His personal stables housed hundreds of horses. His wine cellar was obscene, and all of it was funded by public money and ever-growing personal debt. By the time he became king, George IV was physically bloated, politically distrusted, and financially unmanageable. Parliament despised his indulgence. The press mocked his gluttony and vanity, depicting him as a grotesque parody of nobility. Public sympathy, once generous toward the charming Prince of Wales, evaporated as his debts piled higher, and his attempts to bar his estranged wife from coronation became national scandal. He tried to present himself as the embodiment of refined taste, but to most of Britain, he had become a cautionary tale draped in pearls. Yet, despitior, perhaps because of his excess, George left behind an aesthetic legacy that still draws admiration. He helped usher in the Regency style, a blend of elegance and indulgence, and his patronage of the arts gave rise to enduring works of architecture and design. But the financial cost was staggering. He died in 1830 with debts still unpaid, his estate a labyrinth of accounting nightmares. Creditors continued filing claims long after his death, and royal accountants were forced to liquidate assets and negotiate settlements just to keep the monarchy's reputation afloat. George IV's life was a symphony of delayed consequences, a long, slow parade of unchecked indulgence and financial sleight of hand. He believed that royalty meant never having to say no to a tailor, a chef, or a jeweler. But the monarchy did not exist in a vacuum. Every silk curtain he ordered, every diamond-studded snuff-box he commissioned was paid for not just by Parliament, but by public patience. And by the end of his reign, both were exhausted. He was, in the end, a king who saw the crown as a costume rather than a doutia costume lined with silk and stitched with debt. His story is a glittering reminder that even monarchs cannot outspend the future forever. And yet, in his own deluded way, George IV was a prophet of royal insolvency, a man who set the gold standard for financial mismanagement that future kings and queens would follow, knowingly or not. One such king came long before him, in the age of swords and papal decrees, a ruler whose appetite for conquest, pleasure, and pageantry was so vast that he plundered an entire religious institution just to pay for it. A monarch who had more wives than working treasurers, and who discovered that even absolute power cannot prevent a crown from teetering on the edge of economic collapse. King Henry VIII of England. King Henry VIII wasn't just a monarchy, was a walking, thundering contradiction, an empire stuffed into one man, with appetites as oversized as his ambitions. He ruled not by consensus or caution, but by sheer, unrelenting will. He dissolved monasteries like a man flipping through a catalogue of things he could sell, severed England from the Roman Catholic Church because the Pope dared to say no, and executed wives as if editing a guest list. And through it all, perhaps his most consistent legacy was financial, an unyielding campaign of acquisition, inflation, waste, and debasement that left the English crown richer in land, but poorer in solvency. When Henry took the throne in 1509, England was in relatively stable shape. His father, Henry VII, a shrewd and calculating figure, had rebuilt the royal treasury after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, carefully hoarding coin and maintaining a delicate political balance. His son, however, had no interest in hoarding. Henry VIII was a spender, a builder, a warrior king who saw wealth not as something to preserve but as something to display. His court sparkled with gold and jewels, tapestries and tournaments, feasts that lasted for days. He wanted to rival the courts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, and he wanted to do it loudly. At first, the kingdom could keep pace with his desires. Taxes were raised, loans were secured, and war with France gave him an excuse to spend lavishly on ships, guns, and armor. But the wars were costly and yielded little return. Then came the real turning point, the split with Rome. Officially, it was about an annulment, about his desperate need for a male heir. But financially, it was about control. When Henry broke with the Catholic Church and declared himself head of the Church of England, he didn't just gain spiritual autonomy, he gained access to one of the largest reservoirs of wealth in Europe. The monasteries, abbeys, and religious houses across England held vast lands, gold, silver plate, and centuries of accumulated treasure. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry executed the greatest asset seizure in British history, the dissolution of the monasteries. It was a windfall. Monastic lands were sold or granted to loyal nobles, religious artifacts melted down, altars stripped, libraries burned, and entire communities uprooted. The crown's revenues ballooned. At its peak, the confiscated wealth could have stabilized the monarchy for generations. But Henry wasn't in the business of stability. He was in the business of gratification. The influx of wealth didn't lead to lasting reforms or institutional investment. Instead, it funded more war, more building projects like Hampton Court Palace and Nonsuch Palace, and more displays of personal and dynastic grandeur. Henry maintained one of the most extravagant courts in Europe, with thousands of retainers, multiple palaces, and wardrobes so expansive they required dedicated teams to manage. He gave away lands and titles with the reckless generosity of a man convinced he could never run out. But he did. By the late 1540, the money was gone, the easy gains from the monasteries spent. In response, Henry resorted to one of the most desperate financial tactics available: debasement of the currency. Gold and silver coins were melted down and reissued with lower precious metal content, their faces still bearing the king's portrait, now puffed and jowly. Old Copper-Nose, as the public soon called him, referring to the way the cheaper metals wore away first on the king's nose. Inflation soared, trade suffered, and public confidence in the currency collapsed. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry VIII had transformed England in nearly every possible way, religiously, politically, culturally, but fiscally. He left behind a mess. The crown was in debt, the economy unstable, and the gains from the dissolution squandered. His son Edward VI inherited not just a throne, but a financial crisis disguised in royal robes. Henry's approach to monarchy was fundamentally extractive. He took from the church, from his nobles, from his people, and even from his own currency. He believed, deeply and unshakably, that the king's will justified the king's wealth. He made himself supreme head of the church not only to annul a marriage but to take possession of an entire economic structure. The monasteries fell, not just because they were religious institutions, but because they were rich and Henry was hungry. His reign is a case study in imperial indulgence, the illusion that a state's assets are a sovereign's piggy bank and that divine right extends to fiscal irresponsibility. He lived richly, died gout-ridden and bloated, and left a country that would take decades to financially recover. Yet for all the gold he hoarded and squandered, it was never enough to purchase the thing he most desired: a lasting dynasty, a secure succession, an eternal England shaped in his image. And if Henry's downfall came through the slow bleed of national wealth into personal vanity, the next royal exile would face an even colder reckoning born not of wars or dissolutions, but of revolution in velvet gloves. A woman who once sat beside an emperor, cloaked in diamonds and French silk, would find herself alone in a foreign country, counting francs and memories, trading imperial grandeur for careful thrift, and managing her legacy like a housekeeper dusting the ruins of a vanished empire. Empress Eugenie de Montijo of France. Empress Eugenie de Montijo was born into Spanish nobility, but she dreamed in French. She saw herself not merely as aristocracy, but as destiny with a tiaran empress sculpted from vision boards and Versailles fantasies. She married Napoleon III, nephew of the original Bonaparte, in 1853, stepping into the highest throne France had left to offer. But this was no restoration of old empire. It was a second act written with fragile ink, one more concerned with appearances than permanence. And while Eugenie had charm, taste, and conviction, she also had one fatal flaw. She believed that elegance could outlast economics. The Second French Empire, under Napoleon III, was not built to last. It was a government draped in velvet, stitched with military ambition, and padded by economic speculation. Eugenie stepped into this world with practiced grace. She transformed the Tuileries into a glittering court that rivaled anything seen under the Bourbons. Her salons were the place to be seen by artists, statesmen, generals, and foreign royalty alike. Fashion, etiquette, and extravagance were her tools, and she wielded them like a woman building a dream on a budget she didn't intend to check. Though Napoleon III held the power, Eugenie often influenced it. She advised on foreign policy, promoted Catholic causes, and served as regent in his absence. She wasn't merely ornamental. She was active, driven, and sometimes dangerously idealistic, and her role wasn't cheap. Eugenie's vision of empire was lush, saturated in detail, scented with peonies and dipped in gold leaf. She sponsored artists, architects, and couturiers. She wore Worth gowns so intricately embroidered they required weeks of labor. The empire style was reborn in her image, and so were its expenses. But beneath the satin and ceremony, the Second Empire was financially brittle. France was investing heavily in colonial expansion, urban development, and industrialization. The dazzling Paris of Eugenie's salons, Haussmann's boulevards, the new opera house, the pavilions of the World's Fair was also a city propped up by loans and speculation. When the economy faltered, public confidence wavered. And when war came, the empire's splendor vanished faster than a courtesan at confession. The Franco-Prussian War in 1870 was the fatal blow. Napoleon III was captured in battle. The empire crumbled overnight. Eugenie fled Paris in disguise, escaping through back streets with a few loyal attendants in the haunting awareness that her kingdom had dissolved like sugar in rain. She boarded a ship to England with nothing but haste and humiliation to carry her. Her reign, once crowned in diamonds, ended in a borrowed bonnet. Exile did not come with a pension plan. The Bonapartes had invested in image more than infrastructure, and what remained of their fortune was fragmented, contested, and largely inaccessible. Eugenie settled in England ironically, the very nation that had once exiled her uncle-in-law. Queen Victoria, bound by royal sympathy and personal fondness, extended hospitality, and Eugenie took up residence at Camden Place in Kent. It was a quiet estate, comfortable, but far from imperial. The peacocks were gone. The empire was over. Her financial situation was precarious. While she retained some personal assets, jewels smuggled out, minor investments she now had to budget for the first time in her life. Her lifestyle was scaled down to something resembling noble thrift. She managed her household with discipline, tracked her expenses, and occasionally sold off heirlooms to cover costs. Letters survive detailing her careful accounting, how much for firewood, how little for repairs, how dearly every coin had begun to matter. Even in exile, Eugenie refused to surrender entirely to austerity. She maintained appearances. She entertained modestly. She attended Mass in tailored black. She wrote letters with the poise of a woman who still believed in courts and crowns. But inside, she was shrinking financially, emotionally, historically. The glory days of the Second Empire became hazy memories, rendered in fading daguerreotypes and whispered conversations. Paris moved on. France became a republic once more. In 1879, her only son, the Prince Imperial, died fighting for the British in the Zulu War. It was a loss too cruel for fictiona final erasure of Bonapartist legacy, a bloodline buried far from Europe in the dust of colonial misadventure. After that, Eugenie faded almost entirely from public life. Her fortune dwindled with age. She continued to live modestly, managing her estate with the precision of a former empress now forced to act as her own accountant. When she died in 1920, she was 94, a widow, a mother without heirs, and the last true flame of a broken dynasty. Her life is a masterclass in vanishing wealth, how even the most glittering empires can implode, and how even the most adorned empresses can be left counting coins in the quiet English countryside. Eugenie was royalty wrapped in velvet denial, mourning a world that no longer existed, balancing memory against a ledger that never quite evened out. But she was not the last emperor to discover that exile is the natural habitat of fallen crowns. Long before her, the name Napoleon had already become synonymous with vanished glory. One man had carved an empire from Europe and watched it all burn to cinders. He didn't flee to England. He was sent to die on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic, with no throne, no court, and no gold left to count. Emperor Napoleon I of the French. Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man designed for moderation. He was designed for myth. Sculpted from ambition and molded in the furnace of post-revolutionary chaos, he turned France into a continent-sized chessboard and moved across it like a self-invented king. He crowned himself emperor in 1804, not because he needed permission from the Pope, but because he preferred the optics of divine authority without the nuisance of divine oversight. He amassed territory, titles, and glory, and with equal fervor he racked up debt. While history often remembers the grandeur of his campaigns and the elegance of his code, what lingers in the footnotes is the staggering bill he left behind. Because when the cannon stopped and the horses limped home, Napoleon's empire was not just conquered, it was broke. In his prime, Napoleon controlled more than France. He manipulated economies from Madrid to Moscow. His wars were funded with plunder, inflated loans, and the wealth siphoned from client states. Every victorious campaign was a moving vault gold taken from banks, artwork seized from palaces, and taxes extracted from conquered populations. To the casual observer, it looked like unstoppable momentum. But the finances were never stable. They were temporary illusions of solvency made possible only by conquest. Napoleon did not build an economy. He devoured one country at a time to feed another. Back home, he crafted a glittering imperial court. Empress Josephine before her fall from favor spent as if Versailles had never gone out of fashion. The palaces of the First Empire gleamed with opulence. Marble floors, silk tapestries, and gold-flecked furniture. Napoleon hosted elaborate balls and ceremonies to project permanence. But these pageants were expensive distractions. The treasury, already burdened by years of war, strained under the weight of his need to appear invincible. When he invaded Russia in 1812, it was less a military miscalculation than a financial death sentence. The retreat from Moscow cost not only lives and morale but the economic underpinnings of his empire. The states that once paid tribute began to withhold. Napoleon tried to raise funds by printing more currency, but inflation surged. He relied increasingly on foreign loans, which dried up the moment his aura of invincibility cracked. As his enemies closed in, he mortgaged the very legitimacy of his empire to keep the machine running. By 1814, the French economy was hemorrhaging. Creditors loomed, grain prices soared. The once devoted bourgeoisie grew restless. With Paris under threat, he abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba, granted a pension and nominal sovereignty but no meaningful resources. He arrived on the island with a few faithful officers, a dwindling treasury, and more pride than provisions. His court consisted of a handful of men, a mismatched wardrobe, and the lingering scent of irony. Even in exile, Napoleon couldn't help but perform. He designed roads, reformed local agriculture, and held petty military parades with bored islanders in rented uniforms. But he was running out of money fast. The pension promised by the Allies was inconsistent. Supplies became harder to secure. His letters turned from military dispatches to quiet pleas for funding. For a man who once redrew the map of Europe, he now struggled to secure enough coin for salt. Then came the escape the 100 Days, one last mad dash to reclaim the empire. It was as much a gamble of finances as it was of fate. He returned to France with nothing but charisma, borrowed uniforms, and sheer momentum, and for a moment it almost worked. The people flocked to him, the army rejoined him, but the coffers didn't. There was no money for long campaigns, no time to rebuild the economic engine. The state was in debt, and so was its emperor. Waterloo ended everything. Captured and exiled again, this time the British sent him to St. Helena, desolate, wind-lashed rock in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from everything he had ever ruled. There would be no escape this time. No more soldiers, no more parades, and, crucially, no more budget. The British government paid for his upkeep, but barely. His living quarters were damp and crumbling. His staff was reduced. His wardrobe, once imperial regalia, dwindled into patched uniforms and a few fading medals. His meals were rationed. His books were worn thin, and the man who had once dictated treaties now argued over linen allowances with indifferent British officers. Napoleon died in 1821, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and political irrelevance. He was buried in a grave marked only by a simple tombstone, without even his name. His final estate was contested, his remaining personal effects sold or stolen, and his imperial fortune the vast, shimmering machinery of plundered gold and over-promised debt evaporated like smoke from a battlefield long since gone cold. In the end, Napoleon proved what every emperor eventually learns. You can conquer the world, but you still have to pay for it. Glory doesn't balance a checkbook. Empires collapse not just from cannon fire, but from unpaid bills and exhausted treasuries. His downfall wasn't simply the result of military defeat, but of financial delusion writ large across a continent. And yet, even after his ashes had been interred in Paris beneath a dome of imperial nostalgia, his legacy lingered in places where monarchy still flickered. One of those places frozen, stoic and proud would one day see a king stripped not by war or revolution but by the slow erosion of competence. A monarch whose mind, like his treasury, would slip into collapse, leaving behind a crown without clarity and a kingdom ruled by whispers. King Gustav IV, Adolf of Sweden. Some kings die in battle, others are overthrown by revolution. Gustav IV, Adolf of Sweden, however, was undone by something far more banal: incompetence, wrapped in divine certainty, masked by royal decorum. He was not a tyrant. He wasn't even particularly cruel. He was just spectacularly bad at being a king. And that, as it turns out, can be just as costly for the state and for the sovereign alike. His reign was a long series of miscalculations that bled Sweden of its resources, its dignity, and, eventually, its monarchy. By the end, Gustav wasn't just exiled. He was penniless, forgotten, and wandering through Europe like a man trying to barter a royal title for dinner. Born in 1778, Gustav IV inherited the Swedish throne as a teenager following the assassination of his father, Gustav III. But the real damage would come years later, when Gustav IV took full control of the state. From the start, he saw himself not just as a ruler, but as a divine instrumenta man guided by providence rather than policy. He believed, with unshakable conviction, that kings ruled by divine right and that diplomacy was a matter of morality rather than strategy. Unfortunately for Sweden, Europe in the early 19th century was not a place for idealists. Gustav's greatest blunder, his masterclass in imperial miscalculation, came with Napoleon. While most of Europe cautiously navigated the shifting alliances and brutal pragmatism of the Napoleonic Wars, Gustav chose obstinacy. He despised Napoleon, not just politically but personally. He saw the French emperor as an antichrist figure, a blight upon Christian Europe, and refused to ally with him under any circumstances. This may have made for stirring speeches and moral clarity, but it left Sweden diplomatically isolated and strategically vulnerable. As Napoleon redrew the map of Europe, Gustav's Sweden lost territory, resources, and influence. His refusal to adapt militarily or diplomatically cost him Finland, which was seized by Russia in 1809 after a disastrous war. It was a devastating loss. Finland had been part of the Swedish crown for centuries. The military was demoralized. The economy teetered. The nobility seethed. It wasn't just the loss of land, it was the loss of legitimacy. By the 18th of March 09, the Swedish elite had seen enough. A coup was staged by army officers and aristocrats, fed up with Gustav's rigid rule and catastrophic decision-making. The king was arrested quietly, without bloodshed, and, imprisoned in the castle of Gripsholm. A few months later, he was formally deposed. Sweden would go on to establish a new dynasty under Charles XIV John, formerly a French marshal under Napoleon, a man who understood, if nothing else, how to balance a budget. Gustav, meanwhile, was cast into exile. But unlike some dethroned monarchs who fled with trunks of jewels or foreign pensions, Gustav left with almost nothing. He was denied a comfortable settlement, stripped of his titles, and abandoned by most of his former allies. His attempts to reclaim the throne through pamphlets, letters, and awkward diplomatic entreaties were ignored or politely dismissed. He wandered through Europe for the next 3 decades, often under assumed names, including Colonel Gustafsson. He stayed in inns and boarding houses, dependent on small handouts from sympathetic royals or distant relatives. He lived in Switzerland, Germany, and Austria never long enough to settle, never comfortably enough to forget he had once worn a crown. His letters from this period reflect a man oscillating between bitterness and delusion, still convinced that his moral vision had been correct, even as he borrowed money to pay his innkeeper. By the end of his life, Gustav had become a footnote in European royalty, a sad curiosity, more ghost than monarch. He died in 1837 in St. Gallen, Switzerland, far from Stockholm, far from the crown, and far from relevance. There was no grand funeral, no national mourning. His estate was meager. His debts exceeded his assets. The boy who had been born in a palace and raised to believe he ruled by divine right died in rented rooms, buried without ceremony in a foreign land. Gustav IV. Adolf's story isn't one of sudden downfall or dramatic exile. It's a slow-motion ruin, a lesson in how pride and rigidity can grind a monarchy into dust not with a bang, but with a sigh. His personal poverty mirrored the impoverishment of his reign: empty coffers, empty promises, and an empire that shrank every time he acted on principle rather than prudence. Yet even as his memory faded, the pattern he embodied remained. A monarch, driven more by identity than governance, forced into exile by the consequences of his own convictions. But exile, like monarchy, comes in many forms, and the next royal to wear its shroud would do so with tragic grace, a ruler born into tropical opulence, educated in the arts of empire, and unmade not by war, but by the very republic he once tried to placate. A man who, despite wisdom, education, and restraint, could not outrun the quiet brutality of revolution or the arithmetic of a fallen empire. Emperor Pedro II of Brazil. Pedro II of Brazil was not a man who wore his crown like a weapon. He wore it like a scholar's cap, reluctantly, dutifully, and with a sort of cerebral melancholy that made him one of the most enlightened monarchs of the 19th century, and tragically, one of its most overthrown. If the last emperor of Brazil had any flaw, it was not cruelty, extravagance, or ambition. It was exhaustion. An exhaustion born of decades trying to balance modernity with monarchy, science with sovereignty, and a crumbling empire with a conscience too soft to wield an iron fist. His decline wasn't cinematic, it was clerical. A polite coup, a tearful departure, and a pension that barely covered the memories he carried with him. Born in 1825 to Emperor Pedro I and Empress Maria Leopoldina, Pedro II did the throne at the tender age of 5 after his father's abdication. He was crowned emperor at age 15, an adolescent forced to wear adult responsibility like an ill-fitting uniform. But Pedro was different from the kings who filled Europe's palace, was a voracious reader, a lover of astronomy and languages, fluent in Latin and Greek, and possessed an austere, almost monastic temperament. His personal tastes ran toward the minimal and cerebral. While other monarchs imported jewels and mistresses, Pedro imported telescopes and encyclopedias. His reign, nearly 50 years long, was defined not by conquest or tyranny, but by reform, education, and a stubborn sense of moral duty. He supported the arts and sciences, championed civil liberties, and slowly, steadily, laid the groundwork for the abolition of slavery in Brazil, an act that would, ironically, help end his rule. His governance was moderate and rational in a region not known for either, and for a time Brazil flourished under his steady hand. But empires, like empires always do, get tired. So did Pedro. He lived modestly, even as emperor. His palace was far from ostentatious. His clothes were simple. He declined to amass personal wealth and refused to exploit his position for financial gain. In fact, he often paid for public projects out of his own private funds, a personal generosity that would later become a financial liability. Pedro's wealth, such as it was, dwindled over time. He had no head for investment, no taste for accumulating capital. His royalty was philosophical, not fiduciary. When the monarchy began to wobble in the late 1880, undermined by military discontent, the rising Republican movement, and resentment over the abolition of slavery, it did so not with revolt, but resignation. The emperor, old and frail, with a white beard and tired eyes, watched quietly as Brazil slipped from his grasp. On the 15th of November, 1889, the military staged a nearly bloodless coup. Pedro was told he was no longer emperor. His response was characteristically stoic. "If it is so, it will be my retirement. I have worked too hard, and I am tired." He was given a modest pension and sent into exile with his family. No riches, no jewels, no assets smuggled in trunks. The royal family boarded a ship to Europe with dignity and a few suitcases. They settled first in Portugal, then in France, where Pedro lived in a small hotel in Paris, not a palace, not a villa, but a hotel. He spent his days reading, corresponding with scientists and intellectuals, visiting museums and reflecting on what Brazil had become and what it might have been. But exile did not bring comfort. The pension promised by the new Brazilian government was often delayed, and sometimes withheld entirely. His modest savings eroded with each passing year. Friends helped. Distant relatives contributed. He sold personal belongings, books, art, keeps a questo, cover medical expenses and daily costs. His financial dignity shrank alongside his physical health. There were no lavish dinners, no courtly obligations, just long walks in the cold Parisian mornings and letters he couldn't afford to mail. When Pedro died in 1891, he had little more than his clothing and his library. His funeral was held not in a grand cathedral but in a modest church, attended by exiled monarchs, émigré aristocrats, and a handful of loyalists who still believed that decency, wisdom, and restraint were enough to rule a country. His body was later returned to Brazil, where he was quietly reinterred and posthumously honored as a national father figure. The empire he had ruled was gone, replaced by a turbulent republic. The wealth he never hoarded had vanished, but his dignity, strangely, remained. Pedro II's life closed the book not just on Brazil's monarchy, but on a certain vision of royalty altogether. Not as conquest, nor excess, nor divine entitlement, but as service. A sovereign who ruled not by fear, but by intellect, and who left his country not in gold or glory, but in quiet, crumpled paper notes and the dusty corners of hotel rooms. And with Pedro's passing, the ledger of lost monarchs comes to a pause, not a full stop, but a breath. Because if we've learned anything from these fallen royals, it's that power without foresight is just a gamble dressed in silk. And exile, in the end, is the only inheritance most crowns can truly guarantee.